Hello, and welcome to Fiddler's Green podcast number 36. I'm your host, Dave Green. This is the podcast, sometimes weekly, sometimes more like monthly, where I talk about culture, politics, and whatnot, and try to make sense of the crazy clown world that we live in. So this week, I was going to take on some general topics of interest. I had a relatively long comeback podcast a week ago where I talked about James Lindsay and my recent debate with Professor Matt McManus. But I thought we would sort of take off this week discussing really what everyone will be discussing for the next 30 days, because we've now entered into the holy month. Why am I wearing headphones? That's a good question here. We've now entered into the holy month of Ramadan for our dear alphabet Americans, our two-spirit, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual alphabet people. This is Gay Pride Month. And of course, because it's Gay Pride Month, woke capital is making a show. And people are kind of asking themselves exactly what the response should be. And this is the topic I hit on last week with a variety of other topics. And we'll get to it, but I'm going to kind of wait for people to filter in right now. And people actually tell me the audio is working. That's always a problem these days. Oh, my PowerPoint needs to get on. So before I get started, though, I would like to remind people that if you're interested in coming to conventions, meeting people, becoming part of the community properly. We are running our annual Sildings Conference in Nashville or near Nashville, Tennessee on the weekend of the 23rd. So that's coming up. I believe tickets are still available, but they're going pretty quickly. I myself will be speaking there along with Radlib, Aaron McIntyre, the Prudentialist, Charlemagne. And it's usually just a great opportunity to build things, to meet new people, to kind of become an activist yourself in this capacity. And we'll talk a little bit about activism and things in the future as we go forward. So I think this is something that everyone's thinking about right now. This is something that, and it looks like everyone's telling me that the live stream's going well. It's kind of interesting. I do enjoy watching. I have this bad habit of watching progressive YouTube and just kind of seeing what their narratives are. And of course, every single one of them had a big kickoff event for LGBTQ. And you can kind of see the narratives forming. They're personally, I don't know how it doesn't get cringe after a while, but the narrative this year is we are under unprecedented attack. We are being silenced by the Christian Americans who are organizing egregious boycotts against us. And this is why we have to make this Pride Month be the loudest, be the greatest Pride Month of all time. I was listening to, oh God, I don't know why I do this to myself. I was listening to Demon Mama talk about this for the stream. And they were saying, oh, we need to have, because of the egregious violence done against the trans community in the last month, we need to keep this LGBTQ Pride Month going for another year, another 10 years. And only then will the blood that was spilled from the LGBTQ community over the last month, only then will it be avenged. Only when our holy month is continued for 10 years. And because we've been silent for too long, guys. We've been silent. No one knew that LGBTQ people existed. For 11 months, since last Pride Month until right now, no one knew the LGBTQ Americans were a thing. There's no way that the progress flag is dominated by rainbow colors. There's no way that around the world, when everyone sees the rainbow flags, they think of America more than they think of America when they see the American flag these days. It's practically the symbol. It's practically the uniform of our military. It's on all our tanks. It's on all our cruise missiles and all of our drones that we're sending over to bomb and continue a meaningless war in Ukraine. It's literally paved on all of the streets, all of the crosswalks across the majority, but across an enormous percentage of our downtown areas in the West Coast are paved with rainbow flags, and they'll come after you if they find your skid marks on the sacred icons that adorn our roads. But no, we haven't been loud enough, and that's because of the horrific Handmaid's Tale oppression of Christians. I mean, it really was the focus of most of these BreadTube streams was on sort of this reaction. I haven't really been watching BreadTube recently, so it's kind of been like you've caught a show after you've been away from it a while, so you're kind of piecing together what the narrative must have been in the several months that I haven't been watching, since I've been quite busy the last 2 months, hence why my content has been a lot less. But you could piece together from watching BreadTube that the narrative they've been going with for the last 2 months is this an unprecedented Christian massacre of gay people. That's the narrative they're going with. And somehow, and this is a little bit less clear to me, they're very aware of the Bud Light boycott, and somehow this attempt at not buying shit beer and not going to soulless big box stores like Target, this is part of the trans genocide being perpetrated by people like Matt Walsh. It's always kind of funny I really wish I could live up to the horrific visage these people have of me in their own brains. Be the horrific right-wing extremist left-wing breadtubers think that you are, because it's way more epic than what's actually going on. I should say that this is the pertinent topic that I want to kick off tonight's conversation about, or talking about, which is, we kind of finished on this the last time, and this is the Bud Light boycott. This is the anti-woke boycott. They're going on at Target and a variety of other places. And this is, we were talking about it last time in the context of James Lindsay and his sort of apocalyptic prediction that the Christian right would be completely neutralized by the backlash against LGBTQ stuff. And, this is kind of hysterical ramblings by James Lindsay. This is totally impossible. There is no future for the anti-woke movement. It is a completely spent force. The only future there is for anti-progressivism is in right-wing movements that have a religious foundation. Because this war is a war about belief. And the problem at the end of the day is the anti-woke secularists don't believe in anything. And they're clinging on to little tatters of liberalism that don't even make sense by its own logic. And then they refuse to come to terms with the root causes of this woke problem, which I think we'll get into a little bit later, which ultimately amounts to what I would call hard civil rights or legal and workplace civil rights regulations, specifically stemming from things like the Equal Opportunity Commission. These are spent forces. The only future there is for anti-progressive politics is right-wing. And I would assert, in the wake of the absolute collapse in birth rate, the only future for humanity is essentially a right-wing. The people who constitute the banner of humanity, guarding against a variety of forces, be they runaway transhumanist technologies like AI, be they things like just the straight up fact that no one's having any children, be they the collapsing economic institutions around us, the destabilization of the global world order. These solutions only have realistic solutions in the right wing. That's the only place where realistic solutions are being discussed. And I think this is sort of the operative takeaway you have from communicating with people like Matt McManus, is you just sort of see the fundamental unseriousness of progressive responses to these problems. My friend Lev from Break the Rules podcast, I feel like this is always funny. I know there was a schism between Gio of Giant Art Productions and Lev from Break the Rules, but I still consider both of them my friends, so I kind of feel like I'm a fan of both Art Garfunkel and Paul Simon at the end of the breakup. This Lev, he does more of like an interview, like Internet Blood Sports podcast, where Gio is more of a content creator and a visionary in his own regard, and he streams with Traditionalist on more sort of esoteric topics. But another one of the people I follow on Twitter, PG Keenan, who writes for The American Mind, was on Lev's channel discussing her takes, her reactions to largely concerning the sexual revolution, which is her thing. She wrote this book called Domestic Extremist about how we should re-embrace family life. It's sort of like the Girl Benedict option, if I could paraphrase. I haven't read the book, it's not out yet. But if I could paraphrase her career without being insulting, I feel like she's kind of Girl Rod Dreher. But at any rate, she's on this channel and she's talking to these two other progressives or two other liberals. And strangely enough, this is just part and parcel of being in a blue state these days. It oscillates between sexual freedom to things like drugs and crime, because no one can possibly ignore the explosion of drugs and violent crime in modern American cities. That's essentially hollowing out economic activity at this point. And the problem with all of these things is that the leftist answers were just fundamentally unserious. They're copy pastas from the 90s. Stories about how all of our mass incarceration is due to people being arrested for pot, or the fact that all the difference in arrest rates between various races in this country are because we unfairly enforce drug laws, or the idea that free needle exchange and safe use housing is the silver bullet solution for ending the explosion of drug crime that we had in our cities and the mass fentanyl crisis that we're experiencing that's destroying, I wouldn't say an entire generation of young people, but a large percentage of the young generation in sort of these economically impoverished areas are being destroyed by this drug crisis. And what do we have? We have completely unserious copy pasta platitudes from 1999 in their place. There is no serious left-wing answer to any of these problems. There is just hand-waving feel-good concepts that never materialized from the 60s, like civil rights, and then promises of economic systems that will never be seriously put into effect, like socialism. And we know that they won't be put into effect because the people who preach them don't even bother to live out the principles that they talk about constantly. So this is I've made the mistake of reading the chat. I apologize, but this is sort of the backdrop behind where we come across the boycott of Bud Light, because this has been a remarkably successful boycott, and I'm going to use that in sort of scare quotes. And so people, the right wing is kind of like a dog chasing cars. It doesn't even really know what to do when it catches a car. It knows that it's programmed to do these things. It knows that it's some kind of activist force. And it knows that it has a certain limited number of tools that it can hit back against people who, these corporations intentionally antagonize the red American base, because the red American base has less money, the red American base has less power, and they're a whipping bag, they're a whipping boy, a punching bag and a whipping boy for America's ruling class. They're the demographic that American ruling class and the people who like to pretend that they're American ruling class people, progressives, millennial progressives, they like to use this group as a punching bag. So they're the perfect target for the managerial class that rules these woke corporations. And of course, it's coming, guys. This is June. This is Pride Month. Every single corporation is hopping on the bandwagon. And this is coming from, in May, a very successful organized boycott against Bud Light and a potentially successful boycott against Target. And this is costing the corporations millions, billions of dollars. They're probably going to lose this brand. But this is the sort of the follow-up question that naturally asserts itself. And this is something that, I kind of brought to the floor. The idea is, going into Pride, is that this is going to be, this is the sort of tagline that the Daily Wire put across. They were one of the first people to pioneer this boycott. And their idea was, well, we're going to hyper-focus on Bud Light and we're going to take a scalp. Well, okay, and we'll get into that a little bit later. You're going to make an example out of Bud Light. Well, see, that's the problem a little bit, because Bud Light isn't a thing. And we'll get into this a little bit later. But it's hard to even understand what you mean by taking a scalp. So, and as we get into Pride, you can't just do a blanket boycott. You can't just say, well, we're going to boycott every single company that crosses the line. We're gonna go after every single company that goes woke. They're all going woke. This is built into how we've organized our HR departments. This is built into our law. A company that breaks and identifies itself as a non-woke company will be the immediate target for lawsuits. So there's an incentive of all companies, even if they don't like this stuff, to be as woke or more woke than all of their immediate rivals. Because if they're not as woke or more woke than their immediate rivals, or if they don't have a crackerjack human resources department that's willing to go to the wall for them in court and swear that they're doing everything in their power to prevent disparate impact to protected classes, they're going to suffer massive lawsuits that will absolutely devastate their business model and will make the managers in that company permanently unemployable for the rest of their careers. That being said, it is impossible to carry forward the Bud Light business model indefinitely into the future. So in light of this, I issued kind of just a straight up challenge. And this was meant to be completely Socratic, completely neutral. I don't mean to put down people who pulled off this successful win. I don't mean to insult the dog that finally caught the car. But I do have to ask, Mr. Dog, now that you've caught the car, what do you want to do with it? So we all know this about populist energy. Or we should all know this, having studied any amount of political realism. Populist energy is extremely temporary. It flares up really quickly, it hits hard, and then it goes away. There is no permanent populist energy. Populist energy, in order to be continuous, has to be built into institutions, has to be built into habits, and has to be, in some sense, prestige. A populist energy that goes from the lower class to the upper classes, that force is almost always instantaneous, Because the upper classes don't take their cues from the lower classes about what to do. Unless it's some kind of weird situation like you have in some urban areas where there's sort of a counterculture that borrows from the African American underclass. But that really is more or less a product of what Yarvin used to call the Brahmin Dalit alliance politically, and we won't get into that. But if you do not have institutions or habits or organizations that carry forward, it is a fact of human nature that eventually the energy behind your boycott will dissipate. Are people going to still drink Bud Light? Maybe not. But what will that ultimately accomplish? What do you want after 3 months go by, after 4 months go by, after everyone forgets how they were feeling when they saw Dylan Mulvaney in the bathtub with the Bud Light? After that occurs, what do you want to say? People will be, because they'll remember this. They'll remember you dancing around and saying, oh yeah, we got you. We had a successful boycott. So in 4 months, people will ask, okay, so what was the result of that? What was the result of your successful boycott? What's the permanent thing that lasted into the future? What was accomplished? What are the results? Okay, I mean, the first most common thing, and this is what depresses me a little bit putting this question to Twitter, and maybe I'm getting really bad samples for this, but there's an enormous number of people who seem to believe that getting a win is the point. And moreover, they seem to believe that just asking the question, what are the results? What's ultimately achieved by that? That's somehow raining on their parade. That's somehow bringing them down. That's me just counter signaling them. That's me basically pissing on their enjoyment, just to be a negative Nancy. Although that kind of sounds a little bit juvenile. All I'm doing when I ask them what are your ultimate results is trying to rain on their parade, trying to put them down, trying to demoralize them. I don't know what to say to this. Is the point of activism to feel good, or is the point of activism to materially build something that generates more power? Now, I guess I can, and I understand this, guys. I get the fact that this is a question that the left wing never has to answer. If this were the left wing, and if you were a left wing community, and if the people on Twitter were leftists, getting a win would be fine. That would all you would need would be to get the win and to feel good about yourself and to say that we won the day. We cost them a lot of money. That's all we did. That's all we needed to do. That's all they need to do. And I always say this, that's all they needed to do, because the left is not the right. The left is pro-chaos. It's pro-entropy. They're pushing the cart down the hill. If they create more chaos, that makes more chaos in the future easier to generate. The same thing is not true for pushing a cart up the hill, for maintaining nomos, for maintaining order. Pushing the cart up the hill does not make the next push uphill any easier. There is no accelerating force going up the hill. Second, the left has allies in power, and it has a huge activist apparatus that's only being fed by the groups that are demographically growing in this country. Time is on their side. They have no need to institutionally organize in any way. They do not need to worry about how any given action is going to impact them, as long as it's not immediately embarrassing them and dissipating the force of their energy right now. They do not need to worry about these things. It's not our job to be as clueless or as carefree as the leftists. They can afford to do this. If you want to go with the flow, if you want to have victories that are victories just because they feel good, I'm afraid the right wing is just not the right place to do that, because that is never the case for building anything that matters, that is not chaotic, or that does not just feed more power back to people who already have power. I am always reminded of this. Now, I didn't really think that there were progressives who still believe this, but talking to Matt McManus, one of the periods of our talk, one of the moments in the talk where he really puffed up, and I could see, I'm hitting something that he really feels passionate about, is when he talked about fighting for gay marriage. Now, Matt McManus is a few years younger than me, I think. Well, we're roughly the same age. We're a few years younger. And when I was a progressive, I was a big advocate for gay marriage too. I can't see how anyone in our generation thinks that fighting for gay marriage was some heroic uphill battle. Matt McManus genuinely believed that fighting for gay marriage in the early to late 2000s was a heroic uphill battle against the odds. I mean, even when I was a progressive, I wasn't as disillusioned to think that somehow being against gay marriage was an uphill battle. All of the popular people were for gay marriage. In my high school, certainly in all of the colleges I attended, there were all of the elites in pop culture were pro gay marriage. All of the professors were. All of the great artists were. By the time we were fighting for gay marriage, big rock stars were doing benefit concerts for gay rights. Nirvana did benefit concerts for gay rights, if my memory serves me correctly, and that was 10 or 15 years before I was active in any kind of politics meaningfully. And by the time this rolls around in 2012, you have pop artists everywhere doing their own little rendition of gay rights songs. Lady Gaga was one of the number one hit singles at the time. This is absolutely ridiculous. But progressives genuinely believe that they're fighting an uphill battle because everything about progressive activism is 100% illusion. It's 100% a game. They have no idea what real politics feels like because the only thing they're set up to do is to participate in this activist apparatus that marches around and makes a lot of noise and then gets fed money by NGOs, which is another way of saying it gets fed money by governments. And then they get paid to be professional activists. There's an entire class of leftists that just sit around and wait to be progressive, wait to essentially wait for the next issue to kick up so they can be activists for that issue. And their only qualifications are their progressive opinions. Their only qualifications are, and they have some meaningless soft skills that they got from university. I'm a master at conflict resolution. I'm an expert at communication interculturally. I know how to interface with a variety of different perspectives and bring forward new innovation. Things that are mainly bullshit and not skills. But their main qualification is their point of view. And for them, winning is just sort of continuing this cycle of delusion. Make noise, create a big spectacle, trend on social media, get paid. That's not what the right has to do to accomplish anything. There's I always think of that red letter media phrase. Whenever people do this whole, we just needed to win. I always think of that red letter media meme. Don't think, just get outraged and then get ready for next outrage. I mean, is that the cycle? Get outraged and then get ready for next outrage? Just consume product and get ready for next product? Just get outraged and get ready for next outrage. There has to be something at the end of the day you produce out of all of this. Something that actually confers you more power. And what I mean, and I'm taking this again from Yarvin, is you have to have something that makes future victories more likely, more possible. Something that you can use for the future. And this is why We Want to Take a Scalp was so useful for people like Matt Walsh and the rest of the Daily Wire crowd when they promoted this. It's because everyone understands what take a scalp means. I use this example from the film Tombstone, and I'll use it again this week. There's this scene where Wyatt Earp is being confronted by 5 or 6 cowboys, the guys in the black hats. And he has the gun drawn and they don't. And they're like, well, you can only shoot one of us. And Wyatt Earp is, well, I don't need to, because if any of your boys draw your guns, I'm going to shoot you, Ace. And Ace is obviously the leader. And what happens? Well, they back off, right? Because no one wants to be the first person to get shot. And he'll take out the first 2 guys that draw their guns. They'll get him. But no one wants to be the first guy that draws their gun. And certainly the leader doesn't, because he knows that he's going to shoot him first anyway. And so, that's how disincentives work through asymmetry. That's how disincentives work generally. Is you find somebody and you destroy them, and that acts. And what you're building there is the power you're building is the power of threat. It's the power of fear. If you do this in the future, we will retaliate you and destroy you. The problem is, is that you don't have a scalp to take. There's no way that you can take a scalp in any way, shape, or form from these companies. What Red America and what the conservative movement doesn't seem to realize, what's constantly the barrier in this regard, is because they are slowly losing power over time, they don't really realize that their size is much smaller than they think. Their power is much smaller than they think, and their enemies are much, much larger. Their enemies are always larger than they imagine them. And so their ability to actually execute power the way they imagine it in their minds is very limited. And this take a scalp attitude is a great example of this. Who are you going to take a scalp from? The shareholders. Okay. And people are right about this. People are right. You can conceivably destroy the product Bud Light, right? And I made this meme a few days ago. You could destroy the product called Bud Light. People in red states are now universally going to associate Bud Light with paused products, with Dylan Mulvaney, with woke capital, with their enemies politically, and they're just not going to buy it ever again. Okay, cool. Well, what's going to happen? In this event, the scalp that the leaders want to take are the corporate scalps. Bud Light is not a company. Bud Light isn't even a division of a company. Bud Light is a specific brand made by Bud, which is a division of Anheuser-Busch. And no one is invested in Bud Light, the company. People are invested in Anheuser-Busch, the company. And Anheuser-Busch has, I looked on their page the other day, they have about 20 different products. One of them, Modelo, I think it's pronounced, is another sort of cheap beer product. Those other products, their sales have been skyrocketing at the same time that Bud Lights have been cratering, which means that a large amount of the demand that's being lost by Bud Light is being absorbed by other non-Bud Light products that are also owned by Anheuser-Busch. The shareholders aren't feeling that. The corporate structures aren't feeling that. And moreover, and this is sort of the point of my meme, I guarantee you this is going to be what happens in a month, if it's not already. Bud Light or Bud generally, is going to come out and they're going to issue more of an apology because they're getting hit in the bottom line more. And they're going to say, well, we're retiring the Bud Light brand. And instead, what we're going to do is introduce Based Bud. Based Bud is for the American man. And they'll have a whole marketing campaign that's geared just for Red American. It'll be Based Bud. And then they're gonna also on the side introduce Bud Pride or something like that. Something where they can really let their freak flag fly, and they can market that towards the more coastal elites. That kind of to shore up their image to demonstrate to the trans community that they're not actually betraying them, that they're not actually a political enemy, and so on and so forth. Oh, and someone is. I wasn't aware of this. Anheuser-Busch is now owned by InBev. Okay, so it's even more than that. Even more than that. It's not even Anheuser-Busch. It's a larger conglomerate called InBev. So I imagine that, and I know InBev has a variety of other products as well. So their product lineup must be in the hundreds at this stage. You would have a hard time finding a cheap consumable beverage that isn't owned by InBev or one of these other huge woke conglomerates. So, but between products that are owned by InBev or Anheuser-Busch that are just don't use the Bud Light label, the rebranding to capture Red America again, and whatever other shenanigans they do to get more people in the door, there's no way the shareholders are going to ultimately feel this. They'll feel a little bit of a bump in their profits, but modern day shareholders don't buy stocks so that they can sell them in 1 month. And no one buys stocks for dividends. They buy stocks for growth. That's why I should say this all too. I mean, people don't realize this, but the same people who are talking about how many billions of dollars Bud Light has lost, always when they talk about profitable companies, what do they hold up? They hold up Microsoft. They hold up Amazon. They hold up Google. Anybody who knows anything about Silicon Valley companies is aware that all of these tech companies have very, very, very small profit margins, if not no profit margins. What they produce is market share growth. They pursue market share growth because the people who buy these stocks don't care about dividends. They care about their stock growing in price, growing in value relative to our ever inflating currency, relative to the market of the world. And as long as they grow in market share, and as long as they grow in power, and as long as they're seen as inevitably the progenitors of the future, their value will go up despite the fact that they produce absolutely no profit. So if Anheuser-Busch can somehow come out of this capturing a larger market, it doesn't matter if it loses profit. Modern companies, modern shareholders don't care about that. Okay, well, let's go down the list here. The next sort of scalp you could take are the managers themselves. Okay, but how? I mean, this is the other problem here. The managers, and I said this in the last stream, and I'll reiterate it now because people don't seem to have internalized this. Managers of modern companies are required by law to follow HR rules, which are by and large just woke rules. There's no way they cannot do that. That is something that the civil rights or the hard implementation of civil rights law basically requires. Furthermore, the fad or the trend in corporate America is for woke CEOs. Shareholders like them. They're seen as the wave of the future. And boycotts aren't going to stop that. Boycotts cannot stop this impression. And one of the reasons, again, why this impression reigns is because if you were to countersignal and to suddenly become the non-woke CEO, activist groups would target you and put you under increased scrutiny for one of these civil rights lawsuits, for one of these disparate impact lawsuits. And the thing with disparate impact is it's show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Every company is guilty of disparate impact because disparate impact can mean almost anything. Disparate impact just means having unequal results that you can't prove didn't come from unequal opportunities inside the company. And since almost everything counts as a microaggression or as an upholding of systematic racism at some level by the Robin DiAngelo standard, everyone is guilty of these things. And the second you fall under the activist's eye, by signaling that you're an anti-woke or a non-woke manager or non-woke CEO, all the activists are going to try to get lawsuits on you. They're going to look for employees that are dissatisfied to raise a big fuss. And then you're sitting in court with a lawsuit that could cost you an enormous percentage of the market capitalization of the company. The CEO class itself is not going to go non-woke. So the majority of the managers and the majority of the people making the hiring decisions for managers are going to be woke. Okay, so what happens if you go after this VP that decide to use Dylan Mulvaney? We're going to make her unemployable. How are you going to make this woman unemployable? The more you make her name famous as the VP. First of all, she didn't. To my knowledge, she's not fired yet. To my knowledge, she got put on paid leave. So congratulations, you gave her a vacation. But let's say that you're able to escalate the profit loss to the point where the CEO or even the shareholders believe they just want her gone. They need her to be gone so that they can accomplish a successful rebranding of the type that we discussed earlier. I mean, you don't really hurt somebody by firing them. You hurt someone by destroying their career. People who work at this level, I mean, they leave jobs all the time. These people aren't like factory workers where they work for Ford for 60 years. These people aren't like machinists who operate the same machine for a decade. Moving in and out of jobs is part of the game. As a matter of fact, that's the only way you can get better jobs in corporate America is to every 2 years have the ear to the ground trying to get a higher position in another company because it's much easier to hop up the corporate ladder laterally, no pun intended, than it is to hop up the corporate ladder vertically. In many ways, it's easier to get promoted by another company than it is by your existing company. Getting fired, notoriously, by being too woke will probably help this woman's career because there'll be an enormous number of shareholders. First of all, the media will treat her as a martyr, and there'll be an enormous number of shareholders which will feel like, oh, well, we can get brownie points by hiring this woman as our new VP of consulting. Let's say that I as a shareholder or as a CEO think this woman is a complete bonehead moron. And I don't think that she should be anywhere near executive decisions. Oh, that's fine. I'll make her my new vice president of product enhancement. And they'll put her in a nice corner office with a nice 8-figure salary or whatever. And yeah, she'll just do nothing. She'll just do PowerPoint presentations to the company. We'll send her around the company to give very important PowerPoint presentations. And we don't really care about the money we're paying for her, because when we hire her, we'll be earning goodwill with the activists that can put our company in hot water for various different legal actions anyway. So in the great scheme of things, we'll make money off of that. The whole system is working against you, and you can't take a scalp of a manager unless you can destroy their career. Costing a manager their jobs is not mean anything. The same thing is true, could you modify woke capital? As R.N. McIntyre says, what does victory work for the left? Victory works for the left means your enemies get defunded, you get funded, you get jobs, your enemies lose jobs, or lose careers more specifically, not jobs. And you get to have everyone taught that you should never do this again anywhere. This simply cannot happen. You cannot get corporate presentations about how you should not offend Christians because of the fact that civil rights law and the HR departments are expressly prohibited against that. Woke attitudes will reign because they are the attitudes promoted by civil rights law. So it's impossible for a company to give you anti-woke sensitivity training. That would be borderline illegal. Secondly, you can't get anyone hired into HR departments. There's no anti-woke HR department. This is Adam and Sitch's, brain genius idea when I talked to them a while back. When I talked to them a while back, their brain genius idea was, well, what's going to happen is that the Heterodox Academy is going to pioneer anti-woke HR department materials. There's a bunch of people from Harvard that hate wokeness, and they've gathered in Heterodox Academy, and they're going to release their own materials for HR resources that are going to be anti-woke. Well, there's a problem with this. I feel like addressing Adam. There's a problem with this, Adam. And that is that, and Adam's big selling point for this anti-woke HR department diversity stuff was that, well, we know that HR CRT stuff doesn't work. We know that this sensitivity training doesn't work. None of this stuff will work. It's designed not to work. Giving people PowerPoint presentations about how their behavior should be more sensitive in an engineering firm will not work. The only purpose of the HR department is to have the right sort of ant smell. It's to exude the ideology of the ruling class so that people understand that you are a hard target for a lawsuit. If you're landed inside a lawsuit scenario where you're staring down a judge and you're staring down a potential settlement that could cost your company billions, you know that the public impression is that you are a progressive company, and there's going to be a graduate from Harvard that's going to be able to take the stand, or more likely just give a statement saying, this company did everything that the experts at Harvard and Yale said was necessary to make us a progressive company that was committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Your anti-woke diversity seminars are not going to have that property. They're going to be identified by the progressive establishment as being not them. And then all of the immune reactions that work in favor of progressive policies are going to work against that. So on R.N. McIntyre's list, you can't punish your enemies, you can't get people fired, you can't get your own people hired teaching woke diversity seminars, you can't get people taught not to violate your own interests because the entire legal apparatus is working against you. So none of these payouts, and good luck getting people to actually pay out to a conservative institution. I mean, that might actually be something a little more interesting is what if you could get what if you could get InBev or their division Anheuser-Busch to give a huge cash payment to some kind of activist group that was more or less conservatively aligned. I would say that this is unprecedented. It's unprecedented because it's hard to see these organizations existing and bringing successful suits. Usually the organizations that sort of head up these activist causes, their bread and butter is the threat of lawsuits. And if you're not on the progressive stack, your ability to bring a lawsuit against a modern woke corporation is virtually nil. So the only organizations that are conservative or right wing look from the outside, and all these organizations are political, but they look explicitly political. They don't look like they're actually some kind of interest group that companies feel like they need to respect for some strange reason. The only thing, and this is actually the best answer. So, what are the results of this boycott? The best answers I got from this question, after we kind of dispense with this idea that we can take a scalp. The reason why you can't take a scalp is the thing you're attacking is way, way, way bigger and stronger than you are. And you cannot take a scalp because in order for you to take a scalp, the thing you're attacking will need to feel fear. And the problem is that there's no way the thing you're attacking is going to accidentally feel fear. The second the progressive wing, the progressive cathedral, feels fear, all of its activist organs are going to kick into gear and retaliate against you twice as hard as you hit them. You might be able to get money away from them without noticing. You might be able to organize without them noticing or having a big retaliation. But sending a message in the form of do what we want or we're going to come after you, it's like trying to fire the VP who actually kicked off this brain-dead marketing campaign with Dylan Mulvaney. The more you vilify her, the more they'll treat her as a martyr, and that will mean more opportunities for her, not less. Because being a progressive martyr opens more doors than being a conservative villain shuts. That's what I mean for this thing being way too big. The only answer that I think was the right one from all of this. This is sort of the Conan, yes, that's the right answer moment. The right way to use the energy that comes off of a boycott is to build some kind of alternative. The problem is people aren't really thinking what this would look like. The best example might be something like having people go from using corporate beer, low quality beer, to using local microbreweries. I don't think it's possible to create sort of an industrial scale cheap beer alternative like Anheuser-Busch has with Bud Light or with any of its sort of cheap beer products that might be outside of the scale of our operation. But if Red America were to go from people who took pride in the corporate product to taking pride in the local product, that might be a beginning. Another possibility, another thing that you could build in the alternative is some kind of community networking apparatus where you could signal what kinds of products were sort of aligned. There's a person who was on Alex Kashida's channel, and man, I'm going to kind of butcher this. I'm going to look this up. It's not good form to look things up in the middle of a live stream, but I want to get the person's name right, and I'm kind of blanking on it. It was it'll be down a while. I think it's Nate Fisher, I believe. Yes, Nate Fisher. That's it. So Nate Fisher is one of the organizers for the New Founding Project, and he's an entrepreneur himself, and I think he has the right idea. It's a vague idea, but his idea is to come up with a network of aligned companies. And aligned companies are people who are ideologically interested in breaking ranks with the woke apparatus and who are interested in creating trust networks. And I think that's another key word, trust networks, that they can use for hiring inside this network, that they can use for quality control inside this network. And if Red America could do one thing, it would be come up with a similar idea for consumers. What if there were indexes of companies that bore a brand, that had sort of a mark of approval? When I was a kid, there were all of these small grocery stores under the common banner of IGA. So IGA, and I don't know exactly what IGA was. It might have been some kind of co-op system, but it was called Independent Grocers Association, And it was some kind of co-op conglomerate that was designed to keep small local markets in play when all of the Safeways and Rayleighs and Targets and the big box stores were coming in. And the big box stores ultimately won. I think there are very few IGA stores still out there if the organization still exists. But the idea was to create a sort of standard brand, a standard code of quality, and people were really loyal to the IGA brand. People would go out of their way to shop there, to shop local. If a similar thing could be done by Red America, that would be a huge step forward. And it would also be the portal to some kind of, some type of class or community consciousness. And I know I'm borrowing this from Marx, but this was the problem. This was something that a friend of the show, Juniper Tree, pointed out on Twitter, was that the way to kind of organize around this is to create a prestige product that's better than the corporate alternative. If you go from consuming Bud Light to consuming some kind of local craft or some kind of independently brewed, aligned beer, you've not only just denied Anheuser-Busch or InBev the profit that comes from your purchase of the beer, you've essentially created a banner of identity for yourself that is more prestigious. It looks higher class to drink the small craft beer. And it's better beer. You've essentially upgraded your status. And you can now rightfully look down on corporate beer as not only being something that hates you ideologically, but something that is actually kind of beneath your status. This is sort of I don't know if I use this phrase or if Juniper Tree used this phrase. This is sort of the Mean Girls approach to product alignment. And it's an interesting thing. This is, again, why do boycotts work when they go from the left to the right? I didn't mention this one so much, but another reason why is that left-wing boycotts usually go from the high class to the low. So when rich people stop using a product, that product tends to be considered lower class. But this is not something that's immediately interchangeable. Rich products, people know what high-class products are. People know what low-class products are. People understand what aristocratic behavior is and what aristocratic behavior is not. And so if you can create a boycott such that what you're actually doing is creating a new habit of life that is inherently more aristocratic than your rivals or the thing you're leaving behind, you have functionally created something that's permanent that will filter down eventually to your enemies. Your enemies will eventually pick up the fact that what they're doing is no longer cool, and that will hurt them more in the long run. Now, I understand this, and this is something that I was kind of very conscious of. It was this class dimension when I was putting together this PowerPoint presentation a few days ago. And I'm kind of going to take a changing of gears here because this is a very rambly talk, but I think it's going to be an interesting experiment, if you don't mind. I'm going to kind of change gears here. I was very aware of the fact that not being a corporate beer drinker, I'm not exactly somebody who's in the shoes of a Bud Light drinker who's now boycotting what their favorite brand of beer was. But I was trying to think of an analogy because I'm not. I think people oftentimes think I'm a little more trad than I actually am, and I have a variety of guilty pleasures. And I was thinking of what is sort of the thing that's my own guilty pleasure, or my own equivalent to Bud Light. And the best thing I could come up with was a pretty horribly nerdy card game called Magic the Gathering. Now, again, here I'm going to kind of give you a rundown on how we deal with a problem like Magic the Gathering. Because as everyone knows, my chief kind of vice is board games. And about, was it 6 or 7 years ago, I picked up Magic the Gathering again casually after decades not playing it since I was a kid. And it's a fun game. But I always really feel horrible about this game because I hate the company that produces it. I hate it with a passion. And every time I spend any money on this game, I'm helping my enemies. I'm helping woke capital take a step forward. And I think looking at this game and kind of realizing its flaws is interesting. I was trying to find like, okay, how can I talk about this in a way that relates to Bud Light? And I was trying to think of an in to do this, but this last weekend I didn't need to, because Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, which is the company that owns Magic. Hasbro owns Wizards of the Coast, which owns Magic the Gathering, the card game. They came out with this new product. So, as everyone knows, Magic the Gathering has completely sold out. And for the last year or two, they've been incorporating other intellectual properties to make the game more extendable. So, originally, Magic the Gathering is a card game that has a fantasy theme. It's expandable, it's a deck building game. And new products are released every year to give people new environments to build decks of cards and play the game with. And so as Hasbro has gotten more greedy for profit for a variety of reasons and gotten less connected to the actual core of the game itself, it's extended to different types it's basically said, whatever the intellectual property is, we're going to make Magic cards of that thing. And this last week, they decided to finally create a set focused around Lord of the Rings. and of course, right? It's got to be woke Lord of the Rings. So they released some of their concept art for Lord of the Rings, and this kicked off a quite interesting firestorm on Twitter. And so this indeed is the Magic the Gathering version of Aragorn. This is going to be the new Hasbro Wizards of the Coast version of Aragorn. A little different than you might have imagined him from the novels, where he is explicitly described as Northern European. In fact, the existence of races of people and different kinds of people and a geographic distribution of different phenotypes is a core part of Tolkien's folk mythology inside Middle-earth. Tolkien was a Christian, obviously. He believed in a certain kind of spiritual universalism. But part of the reason why Tolkien wrote his stories was to create a sense of place. This is the place of the Northern Europeans, of the Westernese. This is the place of the Haradrim. This is the place of the Easterlings. These are the hobbits. These are the dwarves. These are the elves. And they're all different people. They're all people with their own customs, with their own history. And when you go to a different land, you actually encounter different people, radically different people than you. And that's one of the charms of Tolkien, is that the people are shaped by their geography radically. The cultures are shaped by their geography radically. And so now, I mean, as you might imagine, you're getting something, and I don't know exactly how much to make this about the ridiculousness of having sort of a woke Lord of the Rings that's kind of been beaten to death at this point after all of the various iterations of woke Lord of the Rings we've had from, I don't even remember, was it HBO who did the Rings of Power series where they had all the race and gender flipped characters? I guess this was even more egregious because they're literally rewriting Tolkien's original story as opposed to just doing fanfic. And so, I mean, they completely butcher this core intellectual property. They completely gut it. And again, I could probably go on for this entire show just talking about the various different problems with wokeifying Lord of the Rings and taking something that was supposed to be deeply contextual and deeply meaningful and putting it in a context that was entirely mixed, entirely. Yes, I'm reading the chat now. It's entirely sort of deracinated. The people are making jokes. The favorite joke I had, and this might get my channel taken down, where someone was circulating a picture of Boromir saying, "Gondor has no king. Gondor needs no king." I couldn't help myself but laughing at that one. But the more interesting thing is kind of examining how we got here. Not simply the fact that we're wokeifying Lord of the Rings and ruining Tolkien, but just kind of taking stock over what happened to Magic the Gathering, the hobby. Now, this is sort of where my own story begins with Magic the Gathering. So I'm a 90s kid. I was a nerd in the 90s. And so I picked up all sorts of nerdy hobbies. But the one that I was really, really into was Magic the Gathering. That was the one that I played avidly. I think every kid kind of played Magic the Gathering a little bit in the 90s. But I was one of the people who played it avidly. I would go to the tournaments. I would try to compete with a lot older people than me. I had all of the decks made out for the different formats, and one of the things that got me really hooked on the series was this. One of my first memories was interacting with one of the earlier expansion sets they had. I mean, early by the game standards, it was called Mirage, and what was so funny about Mirage is that, and this kind of shows you the path of woke culture, is that in the case of Mirage, so Mirage, I think that was 1996, and one of my earliest memories of Magic the Gathering was coming into the GameStop, knowing very little about, not GameStop, it's not GameStop, Game Store. My local game store still exists, and it was a college town, so there's all these college students there. And I sat down for a sealed deck tournament of this new set that I had never seen before called Mirage. So you open the packs, you build your deck, and instantly, like, the 9-year-old version of me is playing against college students, and it's super exciting. I think that was decades ago, and I still remember to the very detail the games that I won against these 23, 24, 25-year-old guys playing Magic in a coffee shop in the 90s in California. And what was so funny about this experience is because I remember this set so well, you kind of have flashbacks, and you kind of see this immediate contrast. Because Mirage was the set in 1996 that Magic the Gathering felt would immediately solve its race problem. So Magic the Gathering, I think we'll go into the prehistory of that before, but it was always based around a general feeling of European fantasy, of Tolkien-esque fantasy. And in 1996, after the game was a few years old, they decided that they needed to have more diversity because this was the 90s. They actually tried to do something interesting, which was to reset the plot line so that it shifted from a far northern continent in the universe to being part of a far southern continent. And what was so brilliant about this cycle of cards, Mirage, was that they did an excellent job doing what Lord of the Rings and the rest of the wokeified version of Tolkien's properties don't do. They're like, okay, well, what if we just imagined what fantasy would look like in an African setting? And so they created this continent of Jamuru, which is sort of like I think Tolkien has a southern continent as well that's African in nature. But the current art designers at that time, which were part of the original team that Wizards of the Coast had for developing Magic, they went all in on African art and on art coming out of Arabic cultures and North African cultures. There's sort of a Timbuktu feeling that the entire set has, a conflict between an Arabic culture and a Bantu culture. And some of the characters look more Arab, some of them look more Bantu, and there's wars between different nations with different genetic admixtures. And everything has a sense of African art to it as well. You couldn't mistake it for Northern European art as well. My favorite two contrasts in all of these pieces, you can see the art here on the top and the bottom left, is the contrast between a witch character on the top and then a saintly woman on the bottom left. And the saintly woman, 100% dressed in African garb, 100% ethnic, couldn't be confused as European, even follows the kind of Bantu art style you see in some illustrations. I know instantly she's a saint. Go up to the top picture. I know instantly that is a witch. And it doesn't look anything like a European witch. It looks like an African witch. It looks like an African witch, and it looks completely chaotic and corrupted. They completely nailed the aesthetic of this on all different ways. And people still have fond memories of this. Certainly I do. And how do you go from this to sort of an intellectual property that's ruined? I consider Magic the Gathering fandom to be kind of a cancer. When we were, my wife had sort of a semi-viral tweet this week when she was pushing it back against this because she's a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and she was very offended at the idea of the African Aragorn. And she got a lot of pushback. And a lot of the pushback was from Magic the Gathering content creators who are all 100% on top of this woke swing from they're content creators, they're advocates for the fan community of Magic the Gathering, and yet they see the African Aragorn, and they say like, oh wow, this is just about having black characters, this is just about having diversity. Well, you had diversity in 1996, and you didn't care. This isn't about diversity. This is about deracination. This is about taking something that meant something and that was grounded in a place and in a people and making it deracinated. There's no call to have another Magic the Gathering expansion that has sort of a deep African mythology to it, the way that Mirage and Visions did. There's only a call to take existing intellectual properties, deracinate them, remove them of their original context, and then feed them back into the pop culture grinder so that they can be consumed as a product. And all of the people who are supposed to be so on board with being part of a community, most of these people who are leftists, who are anti-corporate, they swallow this stuff whole. There's a huge problem with the Magic the Gathering community. There's a huge problem in our relationship with it. And the question really is, how do you fix it? What actually happened, right? It kind of had me examining what went wrong with Magic the Gathering to begin with. Is it even something that should exist? And this is something I think a lot about because it is kind of a consumer product. But I guess I kind of want to go back to the beginning of Magic the Gathering to just talk about what it actually was, because I find the history of Magic the Gathering to be really, really interesting. And I kind of wanted to, in the process of telling this story, to kind of tell the story of Magic the Gathering and lay it all out. And now I'm immediately forgetting one of the founders' names. I can't believe it, but we'll look this up really quickly. This is just what you get for broadcasting late, is you forget. I should have a notepad when I do this stuff. I really should. Okay, there we go. So Magic the Gathering is really the product of three men. And so this is back in 1993. And I think the reason why I'm telling this story is I think that the story of Magic the Gathering is the story of nerd culture generally. And because before I want to sort of judge Magic the Gathering and see like what went wrong, how can we destroy it, how could we reform it, why is it woke, and why do all of the fans of the Magic the Gathering product feel not only like woke zombies, they feel like mindless corporate zombies that can't even tell that they're being fed a soulless product to begin with. If I took all of those soulless, deracinated pictures of Lord of the Rings and I sent them back to the era of the 90s, Magic the Gathering fans back then would have unanimously rejected them as being silly and stupid and mindless political correct pandering. Fast forward to the 2000s, and now the Magic the Gathering community not only will accept a deracinated and pandering version of Lord of the Rings, they will accept the Magic the Gathering being incorporated in all sorts of other mindless products, like Transformers, like Stranger Things, like take your pick, like Doctor Who. And they don't care. They don't care about the lack of flavor. They don't care about the lack of passion. They don't care that the game is being destroyed. They don't care that they're being mindlessly milked for money. All they care about is the fact that the product gravy train keeps on coming and they can have the endless little train of experiences. So what went wrong? And to talk about what went wrong, we have to start at the beginning, again, which is, I think, a sort of turning point for the nerd culture and fantasy culture generally. And that starts in 1992 and 1993. Now, before this point, and really in the 80s, nerd culture was very different than we know it today. It was very much a fringe phenomenon. Now, there were large products that were kind of organized around Dungeons and Dragons. There were a few sort of tabletop games. People might remember Hero Quest. People might remember early editions of Dungeons and Dragons that were marketed sort of as toys. But by and large, this sort of gaming culture, this was something that was contained in the back sections of comic book shops and the back ends of hobby shops. A lot of the stuff that you'd get would have to be mail ordered to you. A lot of it was most of it actually was do it yourself. And there really wasn't so much interest around this nerd culture, this fantasy culture being pop culture generally. There was a very big division between pop culture and fantasy sort of deep gaming culture generally. So, and really I think that Magic indicates a turning point. This ends with a few characters. The first one is Peter Atkinson, the guy on the far right. So Peter Atkinson was a former Boeing engineer. Actually, I think he might have started the company Wizards of the Coast while he was working at Boeing. Boeing is a company in Seattle, by the way. So he was working out of Seattle, Washington. He had a 3 or 4 person company called Wizards of the Coast. Again, a reference to the fact that this company was Seattle-based. It was a reference to Puget Sound, by the way, a city that I really love and spent a large amount of my adult life living in. I love Seattle. And his idea was essentially to create miniature games that people who liked Dungeons and Dragons could play with less time. His product was, we want to build miniature games for people who are more casual, who don't want to get into the Dungeons and Dragons stuff too deeply. Or maybe we want to create games for people to play in between gaming sessions. Say, originally the pitch Peter Atkinson said was, we specialize in games you play before your dungeon master shows up for your weekly Dungeons and Dragons sessions, if you're real nerds. Again, this is a small operation since very few people actually play this game, play Dungeons and Dragons a lot, but nowhere near the level we have right now. So enter the second person in the story, Richard Garfield, which is, I find it kind of interesting that Peter Atkinson and Richard Garfield are both, I don't actually know what Atkinson's ethnicity is, but it sounds super waspy, right? It sounds sort of like old stock American name. So I'm going to guess, he's of a WASP background. Richard Garfield certainly is. He is literally a descendant of, I didn't know this until maybe I got bullshitted by Wikipedia vandalism. But if Wikipedia is to be believed, Richard Garfield is literally the descendant of the very famed but very short-lived President Garfield from the 19th century. So this person comes from a long line of old stock Americans. And Richard Garfield was, oh man, I can't remember what his parents did, but I think they might have been military or foreign service, the same way that Curtis Yarvin's was. And they went from city to city all the time. And his own love was for deep board games like Risk, like the nerdy games that came out in the 80s, like Games Workshop games. And Richard Garfield, by the time he meets up with this group of people, he is a PhD in mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania, studying combinatorics. So Richard Garfield really is a character who's interested in the technicalities of games, of creating a gaming experience that maps onto an intuitive impression about how the human mind operates with strategy and wars over economic resources, and how that can be communicated in physical products. And he has a game that he really wants to pioneer called Robo Rally. He's a combinatorics person, he's a math and computer guy, and he has a series of games that he thinks would be excellent versions of games that would teach people how to think like computers. And so Robo Rally is a really great game. I think you can still buy it. I owned it for a while before I gave it away to somebody. But it's a very, very cool game, and there's open source versions too that you don't need the actual set to play. You can play with a chessboard. But it's a game where you control robots going around a factory, and you have to do certain tasks and stop the other people from doing tasks. And what you do is you send the robots logical instructions and for loops, so they execute algorithms as the game goes on. And so you're basically sending this robot on a collision course to do certain things But the environment changes around you as towers get knocked over, as parts fly away, as your robot gets upgraded or downgraded, or gets parts blasted off of it. But in your program can only be modified line at a time. So it's this really crazy example, and this is what Richard Garfield excels at. It literally embodies the frustration of being a programmer in the space of a 20-minute game about robots blasting each other in a fantasy factory. So it's a really great game. He brings it to Peter Atkinson. No sale. It's too complicated. It's not compact enough. And he says, could you come up with something that would be compact, could be transportable, and people could play really quickly in between their Dungeons and Dragons games? And so Richard Garfield goes back to the drawing board, and he comes up with Magic the Gathering, based off a sketch of a fantasy game he had going for him when he was traveling around. And he had this game called Five Colors, and each color represented a different element from the game Dungeons and Dragons, and the 5 colors of Magic would be fighting over dominance. And so the idea Richard Garfield had was, okay, we're going to sell people packs of these cards, and each pack of cards is going to have a different set of components, a different set of spells in it that you can play. And the 5 colors of Magic, you'll be able to recombine your deck in any way you want, and you'll be able to play them against each other so that everyone will have their own individualized deck, but you'll never know what to expect. Every time you play a different person, it'll be like you're playing a totally different game because the materials they have to bring will be totally different. And this was sort of a huge innovation because it offered the opportunity for collectability, which is another huge component of the game. So, and I hope this stream is gonna go on for a very long time because I'm not sparing any details. But you guys signed up for me nerding out about the history of board games, so you're gonna get a history lecture, whether you like it or not. So Atkinson and Richard Garfield pioneer this game. Basically, the entire University of Pennsylvania department, they get together and they play test on little index cards this game that Richard Garfield, he writes all of the cards and what they do. And they get the game to work, and they develop the identity of the 5 colors. And then him and Atkinson go to this Belgian company called Cardamundi, which is like a self-printing card factory that you can find everywhere online these days, right? And we'll get to that a little bit too. And they print off the first set of Magic the Gathering cards, and they bring it to Gen Con, which is the big Dungeons and Dragons convention for independent game developers. So immediately it sells out. It's an instant hit. There's a few things that neither Garfield nor Atkinson figured out when they started this thing. The first thing they had no idea, they really didn't intend for. Atkinson and Garfield thought that people would basically buy one of their little starter packs and then maybe a few of the other boosters and then make a unique deck, and then that would just be their deck. That would just be their collection of cards. And then maybe they get a few more later. You know, they didn't think that people would just get every single card and recombine the cards in whatever way they wanted. They also didn't really realize that rarity would be an issue. So in the original game Magic the Gathering, cards had different frequencies of appearing. So rare cards would appear only once in a pack, uncommons would appear 3 times, and commons would appear 12 times. This, and the powerful cards were usually rare, just because, Richard Garfield thought that this would be something that people would buy, a very limited number of cards. And one way to limit the abusiveness of overly powered cards is to make sure that they barely ever appear. Well, now that Magic the Gathering becomes a hit and they print more of them, all of a sudden people can buy a whole deck of powerful cards, and the game instantly becomes unbalanced. And so you enter into the period sort of the Magic the Gathering proper. Wizards of the Coast realizes that this isn't just a card game that can be expanded. This is a collectible card game. This is a card game that has a collectible component to it, and it has a game component to it. And immediately Richard Garfield, sort of the game designer, hates this idea. He does not like the idea that you can pay to win a game. He says that Magic the Gathering is first and foremost a game, and only secondarily is it some kind of collective lifestyle choice or whatnot. And the more and more it becomes a lifestyle choice or a collectible, the more it will suffer as a game. He said, I understand, you open a pack, you get a $20 card as a kid. That's a lot of fun, but you can't let the game's qualities be sold for money. But of course, this is against the business model of any smart company who wants to sell packs. So after they're forced to essentially redesign the game and get rid of the cards that were way too powerful. So very famously in Magic the Gathering, there are 9 cards that are too powerful. And everyone knows that the most powerful of those is called the Black Lotus, which is sort of, at this stage, they're worth a ridiculous amount of money. Their solution is to take those out of print. And then because they're out of print, no one will ever play them. There's attempts to reprint older cards, and people get angry at this from a collector point of view. And so at this point, Wizards of the Coast says, okay, we're going to take a certain number of cards out of print, and we're never going to print them again, and they're only going to be legal to play in a certain type of legacy format. And this creates problems down the line for them, but it essentially creates a game that for the time being is fixed. I probably get into I'll get into this, right? So I should actually go back and bring in the last person in this equation, right? The last person in the history of Magic the Gathering. So right around this time, Magic the Gathering is created a revolution in nerd culture. An enormous number of people are coming online to fantasy card games for the first time. A lot of young kids, myself included, are on board with this really, really early on, kind of before we could even properly play this game. And people are kind of wondering how the ecosystem is going to develop around this game. And this is where sort of the third person enters in, which is Mark Rosewater. Now, I have no idea where this person comes from. Mark Rosewater is, he's not descended from wasps. He, as far as I can figure, he comes from Hollywood. So he is a person who has a career working as a producer on television shows in Hollywood. And somehow, around 1994, he becomes the chief person in charge of managing Magic the Gathering for Wizards of the Coast. And, first of all, I want to step back here, and I want to say that I think all three of these men are just total geniuses. These are Promethean individuals, but I think it's interesting to see how the very different roles they play. Atkinson is very much an engineer and a businessman in the old sense. Richard Garfield is very much a game designer, an engineer, a mathematician. Mark Rosewater, on the other hand, is a marketer. And Mark Rosewater is the person who takes Magic the Gathering from a flash-in-the-pan phenomenon that captured everyone's imagination between the years of 1992 or 1993 and 1996 and turns it into an indestructible force in culture, the largest game ever, the most popular property game ever made. And the most and a phenomenon that is essentially modified nerd culture and essentially mainstream nerd culture in a large way. And I'll get into his contribution immediately, but what Mark Rosewater understands that these guys don't understand is that Magic the Gathering isn't a game. Magic the Gathering is a lifestyle. And that is what's ultimately going to be the problem with this whole equation. But I'm going to come back to this. So Richard Garfield goes on, and after he leaves Magic the Gathering altogether, and he goes on to develop a few other games. Obviously, with the amount of money he made from Magic the Gathering, he goes on to develop Robo Rally, which is a good game, but no one really likes. He then makes a sequel to Magic the Gathering called Netrunner, which is one of my personal favorite, probably is my favorite game of all time. And Netrunner is the fix to Magic the Gathering. Netrunner is it's an asymmetrical game that works like Magic the Gathering. It's a deck building game. And it's about essentially trying to steal corporate property from a sort of neuromancer cyberpunk universe. And the problem with Netrunner is that, it was late to the party in terms of collectible card games. And it was... And it also had a cyberpunk theme 3 years before The Matrix came out. Nobody knew what Neuromancer was. Nobody wanted to inhabit this bleak world of soulless corporations crushing the life out of humanity while you tried to stay out of the way of large AIs and steal information. So it was an unpopular game, even though the design was brilliant and it fixed all of the problems that Magic had from the beginning with its own design. So go forward from this, and then there's also, once he developed The Great Dalmudius, another great game that's not collectible, a variation on a card game called Struggle with Classes. Mark Rosewater, on the other hand, the other person that goes on, he becomes the lead designer for Magic the Gathering after Richard Garfield completely leaves the scene. And there's a great video of his. Again, I think Mark Rosewater is a complete genius. But I also think his vision for Magic the Gathering is very, very different than Richard Garfield's. And there's this excellent video that I highly recommend anybody who watches interested in board games or interested in board game design or just interested in marketing, sort of consumer culture. This is just, I can't recommend this video enough. It probably even involves some politics, but this is Mark Rosewater's GDC showcase talk called Magic the Gathering 20 Years, 20 Lessons. So in this talk, Mark Rosewater outlines his 20 years designing a game that he didn't design. Well, which is not trivial. I mean, this is an expandable game. This is an expandable game that has quality, that has rules that change over time. New cards are introduced with new rules and new mechanics, and the game evolves over time and self-corrects itself. So a large amount of what Magic the Gathering is today, and it's a better game than it was in 1995, God knows. In 1995, all the kinks were still there. It wasn't a very balanced machine, and by now it's balanced. A lot of those design decisions had to do with Mark Rosewater's deft hand at making sure that the game was balanced and fun to play. You will not discover any of those pieces of advice in these 20 lessons that Mark Rosewater has in his 20 lessons for Magic the Gathering. The core of all of his 20 lessons, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, are how to take a game and turn it into something that people integrate into part of their identities. That is Mark Rosewater's wisdom. What Mark Rosewater realized was that what really drew people to Magic the Gathering is that they felt that this product defined them as a person. And the more you could play into this, and he has 20 different ways you can play into this idea of the product, the consumer product as part of you as a person, the more you moved away from it being like chess, the way that Richard Garfield thought of it, to being like, this is a core part of my identity. The more people would make this a permanent feature of their life, the more people would love it. The more people would glom onto it. Is there anything nefarious about this? I think that, given the story I just told, it's easy to imagine Mark Rosewater as the villain, given that I think that in some ways games shouldn't be part of your identity. Games should be like chess. They should be intellectual puzzles for your mind to solve. They should be ways for you to build community with people that you want to build community for. Alternatively, they shouldn't be just little alternative areas of fascination that have zero connection to that, or banners for your own identity. But that is essentially what nerd culture wanted in 1995. That is what made Magic the Gathering a success in the decades going forward. In 1995, every single person under the sun was developing their own Magic clone. And the question was, who can kill Magic the Gathering? Who can create a better Magic the Gathering? Magic the Gathering was a very flawed game in the 90s. People don't remember. It was a very flawed game because it was the first of its type. It had whole mechanics that were just totally unsuited for card games, and that still sort of haunt the game 30 years after its development. And they still haven't completely worked out these kinks. But nevertheless, Magic the Gathering won out because Mark Rosewater realized what was actually going on. What was actually going on was a contest over people's identities, was a contest over people's love, was a contest over people's belief. And the more Magic the Gathering played into that, the more it would prosper. For instance, I'll give you an example. Wizards of the Coast does not, and people, Magic the Gathering is very famous for having cards, like individual cards that you can buy in the secondary market that are worth a lot of money. The most famous one is Black Lotus that sells for hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know anyone who plays with that card. It's more or less a collector's item. I guess there's a format you can play with that card, and you could basically trade the card in for a house at this stage. And part of my own tragedy is I had some of those cards that you could trade in for a house, and I sold them for a few $1,000s when they weren't as valuable as they are now. And I thought, oh, wow, I'm making so much more money. I'm making hundreds and hundreds of dollars, right? And I bought a musical instrument with that, thinking that was being very clever. But regardless, everyone thinks, oh, wow, this is because of corporate greed. The reason why these cards cost hundreds of dollars in a secondary market is that Wizards of the Coast is trying to make money off them. Well, that's not true, right? That's not true, because Wizards of the Coast made all of its money from printing Black Lotuses back in 1993 when Richard Garfield was head of design, and they didn't know how to make the game. The only way Wizards of the Coast makes money is by people buying new cards. And the only reason people buy new cards is because they buy new packs to keep up with the evolution of the game. But the reason why these high-value cards are essential to the game is because the high-value cards allow people to emotionally invest personally in an identitarian way with their own collection of cards. And this plays into Mark Rosewater's vision of game playing as personality, as game playing as identity. And this is something that extends beyond Magic, but Mark Rosewater is very famous for coming up with this terminology for game players generally. If you're in any board gaming context, you will have heard of these three types of board game players. This started in Magic, and it extended through all different avenues of board game playing. So the three different archetypes of board gamers are Spike. Spike is the person who plays to win. Spike is the person who plays because he wants to prove something. He wants to prove that he's the best at this game. Johnny is the person who plays because he wants to demonstrate something. He wants to explore something. So Johnny is the game player that wants to take a game and see if he can play it in a weird way, giving himself a handicap that his brain can kind of churn out, sort of in the Richard Garfield sense. I want to explore this kind of weird theory I had about how you could win this game in this way that you never thought of, and prove that it could be done this way. And then the third one is Timmy. And Timmy is the person who wants to experience something in the game. Timmy is the person who's playing the game kind of as an extension of Dungeons and Dragons. He wants to have the experience of role-playing the game. The thematic element of the game really matters to him. And, everyone's a little bit Timmy, everyone's a little bit Johnny, everyone's a little bit Spike, but these are the three types of board game players that you will see everywhere. And the concept, unless he stole it from somewhere, is Mark Rosewater's. And he built this into the game of Magic the Gathering very, very prominently, to go forward. And, to continue with my own story, right? Obviously I left the game after high school. I sold all my cards for a few $1,000s and thought I was a super genius because I made 10 times the amount I'd probably spent on them in all my years playing. And, I kind of forgot about the game until I got drawn back into it when I was at a local board game convention and I saw this game. Now this game and I saw this game on the shelf and I'm like, Netrunner? Isn't that Richard Garfield's game? Netrunner, again, had been released by Richard Garfield in 1996 as his sequel to Magic, and as his improvement. And it instantly failed because it was bleak. No one really was into cyberpunk in the mid 90s. It might have been more popular if it had been released around the time of the Matrix, but it wasn't. And it was a failure. It was sort of put into the dustbin of history. But I see this game on the shelf and I'm like, that's Richard Garfield's old game, right? Well, what had happened was that a bunch of Richard Garfield fans had found Netrunner, and a company of board game fans called Fantasy Flight Games had essentially said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take everything about Magic that Richard Garfield wanted, and we're going to make a game that does everything he wanted and nothing that he didn't want. So in Netrunner, everyone's going to have the same set of cards. It's still a deck building game. It's still a game where, you build your own decks, and there's a meta that you can struggle with, and we'll release updates periodically, but there's no rarity. It's a subscription. You can expand the card pool or not. It's a subscription model. There's no rarity. There's no cards worth hundreds of dollars. There's no pay to win. It's standard out of the box, or with a certain number of expansions that you can buy at your leisure, right? Secondly, we're going to walk into all the mechanics that Garfield wanted: the asymmetrical nature of warfare, the bluffing aspect, the strategy aspect is much stronger in Netrunner. It's everything that you could possibly want as sort of one of the original fans of Magic the Gathering. And this is so funny, is that, when I first met my wife, I was really into this game. And I used to play it at game stores all the time. And I finally thought, man, this is sort of the perfect solution to all of the problems that Magic the Gathering has. It's an open game. It's there's lots of people who play it because it was something that was supported by game stores. They would release updates to it periodically, which were very affordable, yearly or so. And the nature of this game was to be able to I thought, well, this is the absolute, this is the fix is in. The fix is in. Well, the fix wasn't in because about 3 months after, or about a year after I started playing this game, Wizards just killed it. The company that had essentially created Magic the Gathering felt that this rival product was getting too big for its britches. And they just pulled the IP away from the product, away from Netrunner. And so Fantasy Flight couldn't commission the cards anymore. They couldn't sell the game anymore. And because nobody could buy new copies of the game, the community immediately faded away. And this is kind of struck me as odd too. I eternally kind of was wondering what happened to this thing. The core of this is a problem in Netrunner too. I used to play this game in Seattle, and I was kind of a tech bro myself back then, and I was religious and I was conservative at the time, but I was always used to be so irritated the fact that the people I played this game with were kind of like incredibly effeminate tech guys from Seattle. But I loved the game, so I played it anyway. And I thought to myself, okay, well, look, everyone still has the game in their possession. Everyone still has the cards. We can still play this game. We can still, we don't need the company to keep on producing it to play it. But that's not true. That's not true. Because as soon as the game had its support pulled, as soon as the rug was pulled out from under the feet of Netrunner, game stores stopped promoting it. Game stores stopped organizing tournaments, and and everyone lost interest in it immediately. And you immediately see sort of the problem with killing Magic the Gathering. So here's a problem with Magic the Gathering. So let's say that you like Magic the Gathering and hate Wizards of the Coast, the same way that you might like Bud Light and hate Anheuser-Busch or InBev or whatever. And you want to kill this product. You want to hurt the company. The problem is that you can't. The company has got you by the balls because of the innovations of Mark Rosewater. I thought that there was a Netrunner community. The problem is there's not a Netrunner community per se. There's a consumer community that buys Netrunner, the product. people do not like each other because they play board games together. They like each other because they buy the product, and their identity is contained in the product. Once the product no longer renews itself in a corporate sense and no longer gets fueled by the corporation, that can no longer be a consumer product that actually fascinates people. When I was in Seattle playing Netrunner, and again, it's all these sort of like really oddly effeminate. And whenever I'm the most masculine person in a group, I know something has to be wrong. I mean, I don't think I'm effeminate by any definition, but I'm certainly not the most masculine guy in the world. And I was always by far the most masculine guy who played Netrunner, which might say something about why I shouldn't be in board game groups to begin with. But there you go. That just shows you how the Seattle, Puget Sound Netrunner groups were back in the day. But I always was playing these games. And someone said something to me. They said, Netrunner is my lifestyle game. And when they said those words, lifestyle game, I immediately kind of shuddered to myself. And I realized before the game was even canceled that this entire culture was just poisonous to the core. The entire culture is poisonous to the core because people's identities aren't based on playing games. The identity, again, is based on the consumer product. And this is the other question with Magic the Gathering. Here's another thing I never figured out myself. Very few people play Magic the Gathering competitively in tournaments set up by Wizards of the Coast. So why don't people just print their own cards? I mean, I print my own cards when I play this game all the time. Proxies, they look better. The proxies look better than the shit art cards that Wizards of the Coast puts out. They look better. You use classic art from museums, and the cards look brilliant. People will compliment you on them more. They'll cost pennies. You can order them up from the same company that Richard Garfield originally printed the original set of Magic the Gathering cards from. In Belgium, or there's tons of these companies now that print your own playing cards. So why doesn't everybody just print their own Magic the Gathering cards and only use the official ones for the very rare occasions when Wizards of the Coast can actually enforce their IP control over this product? Answer, it's because the product was the identity. It's because the product was the identity. Wizards of the Coast, and I don't know exactly how to finish this here. It really comes down to that red letter media thing. The problem right now is, if you wanted to curb the abuses of Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, where they're constantly trying to milk more and more money out of the fan base would have to actually exist. The problem is that the fan base thinks it exists. The fan base thinks that there are a group of people that loves playing board games, and Magic the Gathering is just the best one. And indeed, Magic the Gathering is a great game. And if you walk into a modern day game store, you don't play your favorite game. I would rather play Netrunner. You play the game that everyone else is playing, which is Magic the Gathering. Because nobody cares that there is the best game ever that was cheap as dirt that came out 5 years ago but was discontinued. They play the game that is the product that is being sold to them by the giant corporation that can pay people to play it, and that moreover can facilitate them with an identity. Some people saying that they draw their own proxies. That's even better. I love to have a hand-drawn proxy. I think that's the healthy way to play it. The thing is, what you realize instantly is that nobody likes what Hasbro is doing. Nobody likes the fact that they're selling out their product to every single IP that goes around, that they're going to have Star Wars Magic cards and Pokemon Magic cards and Transformers Magic cards, because they have to sell their product to every single person, to every single demographic. They don't like the fact that the fantasy worlds that used to be created by Wizards of the Coast, like those seen in Mirage, have to be mindlessly supplanted by brain-dead woke products that are just transparent injections of PC culture into existing properties where that wokeness makes absolutely no sense. No one likes this. Everyone complains about this. But they complain about it, and they make absolutely no attempt to fight back against it. One of the things that I kind of discovered, reading my wife's timeline when she was complaining about it, is just how utterly repulsive the Magic the Gathering content creator community is. I know one person in sort of the anti-woke sphere, Jeremy from The Quartering, came from this group of Magic the Gathering content creators. But really, like, the people who remain there are just the most repulsive group of sycophants ever. They will apologize for any political move Wizards of the Coast does. No matter how brain dead they are, no matter how much it besmirches both the quality of the game and makes mindless money for Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, they will always apologize for it. And they will always apologize for it because they know what they're peddling. What they're peddling is Hasbro's corporate identity product. They are essentially the children of Mark Rosewater. Magic the Gathering does not exist as the phenomenon it does if anyone can print their own cards. If anyone can print their own cards, then it becomes a Richard Garfield game. It becomes a game of strategy that anybody can play. It can become a game that anyone can sit down and do, and becomes immediately less of a lifestyle. Immediately, what insofar as a game can be a lifestyle, the game becomes about thinking. It becomes about statistics. It becomes about strategy. It becomes about art. It becomes about community organizing. It becomes less about buying a certain product from a certain corporation that has your particular IP stamped on it in a unique way so you can hold it up as your identity because you're completely deracinated yourself. How to kill Magic the Gathering. How to kill Magic the Gathering is the same way that you actually kill Bud Light. It's the same way that you fight back against Anheuser-Busch. I can't kill Magic the Gathering by taking down Hasbro. I can't do that. What you can do, I mean, so for instance, I'll go back here. You know, what would all of these sort of ass hats from the Magic the Gathering content creation community, these guys are all socialists, by the way. They're all leftists. Some of them are even explicitly communists. And they advertise their leftist credentials all the time. And they complain about Hasbro, the corporation, all the time. And what does this ultimately result in? This ultimately results in them complaining about the cards costing too much for MSRP. The problem is not the cards costing too much for MSRP. The problem is the IP to begin with. As long as Magic the Gathering is a lifestyle that is sold to you by a corporation, then it will always be a form of your own slavery. It will always be a form of corporate slavery. But the problem is that the identitarian nature of Magic the Gathering, the nerd identity that keeps you buying from Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, is the same identity that keeps these guys' fan bases watching them. And the second that identity is undermined or supplanted, their content has to survive on its own 2 feet, which means it immediately becomes more risky. It immediately becomes less of a comfort product. The only way these people could be, if these people were honest about the good of the community of people who actually wanted to play the game, who actually wanted to get out from under the thumb of Wizards of the Coast, it would be an all-out attack on Wizards of the Coast IP. They would be encouraging people to print their own cards. They'd be encouraging people to set up alternative proxy-only Magic the Gathering leagues. They'd be constantly challenging Wizards of the Coast, sue me, I dare you, sue me, for copyright infringement because I'm playing identical cards to yours in this standard IP violation that's well within fair use. There would be a constant, they would be organizing these things that they had all cared about the fan base. Because they know that the second Hasbro does anything, they have to follow suit. Hasbro can kill Magic the Gathering anytime it wants to. It can kill any other IP anytime it wants to, even if they're trying to play fair. The way to kill Magic the Gathering is to attack Wizards of the Coast's IP by building a community where the identity of that community does not rely on the product itself. As long as Magic the Gathering people play Magic the Gathering and just coincidentally have to hang out with detestable people that happen to share their allegiance to corporate product, the corporation will always own them. This is also the mistake of Red America, and there's a reason why this is a nerd confessional. And people are giving shit. I can see, I've read the chat. I understand people are calling me a nerd in the chat. I understand that this is a nerd confession of my own, But the reason why I selected this particular night to confess my greatest vice was because I wanted to think of my own equivalent of Bud Light. I didn't want to be haranguing Red America for drinking corporate beer when I was playing corporate board games in very much the same addictive capacity. But and I want to emphasize here that the the addiction and the problem is the same. It's the same issue. Red America built its identity as beer drinkers around a corporate product. We built our identity around a corporate board game. The issue is that the network has to be stronger. The network of people who do the things that share your ideology, that share your moral outlook, has to be stronger than the thing you do, the product you consume. What defines your group of game players has to be a common spirit, a common aesthetic, a common community. And you can play Magic the Gathering, you can play the Great Dalmuti, you can play Robo Rally, you can play Netrunner. It doesn't matter. What bonds you together has to be the community, has to be the network. And once that happens, once there is a network, once there is a folk culture, everything immediately becomes more life-giving. At that point, you can take Magic the Gathering or you can leave it. You can take you can take Bud Light or you can leave it, because you know that you'll be able to organize around positive things. At this point, Red America is totally focused on the amount of money they're taking away from Anheuser-Busch and InBev, when they really should be focused on the amount of money they saved not buying Bud Light. The money they saved not buying Bud Light could be poured into an alternative product, could be poured into, more importantly, organizing an alternative network. That network, if you could come up, say, with an alternative network of, in Nate Fisher's words, aligned quality products. We're aligned quality beer drinkers. We are interested in coming up with the best beer you can possibly get that's in a network of companies, a network of brewers that is guild aligned, that is ideologically aligned with our values. And, if someone produces a good beer that's not aligned with our values, we learn from them and then we bring it home. We bring their technology home to our own group and we try to do a better job there. And in the end of the day, our pride is not in our product. Our pride is in our network. Our pride is in the bonds of trust that we build. This is going to be a theme throughout the year. It's going to be a theme of my Soullinks talk for the conference that's coming up in 4 weeks or 3 weeks now. Wow, I really have to get on top and finishing my speech. But this is going to be a theme. The trust network has to be the first step on the way of actually building something. In 4 months, nobody is going to remember the boycott. And certainly InBev and Anheuser-Busch will have found ways to recuperate. In that time period, the energy needs to be used to build networks of people who are aligned in positively building something for the future. That would be really useful right now. If you're a Magic the Gathering player or a nerd hobby player like me, there should be entire communities built around trying to take away as much as possible the Magic the Gathering game from the Magic the Gathering IP that Wizards of the Coast holds. And building that into an ideologically aligned community should be a priority for people who are in this sphere. This is one reason why I did a series on nerd culture about 3 years ago when the channel was more focused on making edited videos, and this was my conclusion as well. The point of this, and I don't think that nerd hobbies we just have to eschew them all together. I don't think that because the core of my identity is obviously Catholicism and deep culture and ethnos and finding a future for future generations, I don't think that precludes me from having nerdy hobbies or relaxing from time to time. And obviously I think a little bit of shame is fine, right? I'm not gonna say it isn't. Black Horse, my friend Black Horse, way more based than I am, constantly shames me for my board game hobbies. And that's actually good, because as a Catholic in me, I think that having a little bit of shame in this stuff is a good thing. But one of the reasons why I think it's not completely parallel or not completely antithetical to our larger goal is that we need to relearn all of the ways we used to have fun in more based ways. We need to relearn the utility of sports in a way that's separate for professional sports, in a way that's separate from ESPN. We need to relearn the vitality of deep board gaming in a way that's separate from Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. And moreover, we need to know where these companies can be hit where it hurts. And these companies are not hurt in their profit margin, they're hurt in their intellectual property. Intellectual property and the destruction of heart intellectual property regulations has to be a core of anti-corporate efforts going forward from a dissonant direction. And that's where we have to start. Always be building the network. So anyway, guys, that's the talk for tonight. Way different than my usual spiel. A little less serious, but I hope you forgive the geek out about the history of Magic the Gathering, but something that kind of fascinates me, especially the difference between the various creators of Magic and the paths. I always, and maybe I'm making too much of this. Maybe, and I don't know these people. Obviously, I'm just going from what I've heard in their talks. But I do think it's funny how Magic the Gathering, its creator history, goes from sort of the Promethean small-scale engineer to the Promethean visionary Faustian to the literal genius manager. You can literally see it make that kind of progression, right? From the original Wizards of the Coast to Richard Garfield to Mark Rosewater, and each of those, and into where we are right now. And I think to be fair, I look at Mark Rosewater, and even I can tell that he does not like what's happening with Magic the Gathering currently, where they're just bastardizing it to sell more product to a greater and greater to a lower and lower common denominator at all times. It's like Sam Hyde said, they're perverting things, and it's getting to a point where even I have a problem with it. I'm sure Mark Rosewater is feeling that way right now. Like they're commercializing this product, and it's getting to the point where even I have a problem with it. but that is what it is, and it's a good thing. To be aware of. So guys, I'm going to put the intermission on now, and I'll come back for super chats in about 5 minutes. I definitely need a drink of water. right, guys, I'm back. Just need to rearrange this here. There we go. Okay, guys, so the entropy link is in the description, and now I will take an hour or so to answer your questions, or as long as it takes me, I guess. I have my water here that I forgot, so be able to rehydrate. Yeah, again, yeah, thank you for indulging my nerdy takes. But I always really would. My dream is to, I mean, not dream, obviously, but it would be really nice to get a subset of people in basket weaving who are really into board games. I've worked on this a little bit. I've met a few people, but organizing groups of people to play various games is always a little difficult because you always want to meet at some neutral location, and that's not always very available. But who knows? Dark times are coming, and maybe all superfluous things like board games will have to be put down for a time. But I do think that leisure is important. I do think having ways to build community that aren't super serious and political are important. And it's something that we can talk about producing in the interim. In the meanwhile, I absolutely love people who design their own Magic the Gathering cards. That's one of my favorite things to do. And when people will allow me to play a 100% proxy deck, I will always do that. It sometimes and it's super cheap. So the thing is also Magic the Gathering is kind of a language. The thing is that almost everyone knows how to play it in these circles, so everyone can. So there's that too. All right, guys, I'm going to go for the super chats now. Kevin Hine for $5 USA. In the last stream, you said the great mistake of evangelical Christianity is that it was trying to be triumphant, that it was trying to justify itself. It was trying to play modernity's game. Can you please explain what you meant by that? Yeah. So a few things. From its inception, what I mean by evangelical Christianity's inception, I mean sort of the 1980s version of evangelical Christianity, or really the 90s, because I have no experience of what this was in the 80s. All I have is the few people I know from the late 90s and the 2000s who were into this stuff. But that generation of people who sort of were evangelical Christians in the 90s, they were very consciously aware of the fact that Christianity was on the back foot culturally. And they were very aware of the fact that they had suffered large losses in the culture war, and they were about to suffer even larger ones. And so the thing is this is what I see a lot of times in specifically red American circles, but it's a constant sentiment where people, they just want to win. They just want to feel like they're winning at all costs. They just want to feel like they've had a momentary victory, that they've scored a point on the left. And really, what they can build from that victory is secondary, because they just want to feel like they're on the winning side. And so when you encounter evangelical Christianity in sort of the early days of the New Atheist movement, when I was an atheist, you encounter something that feels very, very self-conscious, that feels very, very defensive, and that feels kind of cringingly sycophantic. Evangelicals were constantly trying to be winsome. They're constantly trying to win you over and to be super nice to you, which is something that, being nice is very good. And, I think Mormons kind of pulled it off better, if you don't mind me saying that. They did, their kind of winsomeness seemed a lot less performative than the evangelical people that I knew. And where was I? That was sort of complemented by the fact that during the New Atheist period, all the evangelicals went hard into this apologetic stuff. And apologetics is really a very misunderstood science. Not really a science. It's a very misunderstood art. Apologetics is supposed to be a particular explanation of religion in a rationalistic form. It is not an answer to the kind of hard atheism that we were experiencing in the 2000s. The atheism we were experiencing in the 2000s was a sort of a rejection of all previous wisdom that had come from before the civil rights era. That was what it was actually about. What new atheism was actually about was, I want to snub my nose at everyone who lived before 1968 and said that they were ignorant and stupid and whatnot. And Christians brought to this a debate about why non-contingent beings are necessary for existence under the cosmological argument of God, and no one cared. I guess that sort of answers your question. Perhaps I'm not answering this well enough. I would say that the other problem with evangelical Christianity was that most of the people who adopted it didn't have a very thick culture. And this is something that immediately struck you as a Catholic or somebody from a kind of a culture that had very recently come from the old world, and that even in my American branch of my family was Catholic as opposed to Protestant, was that the people who followed evangelical Christianity were probably WASPs of some kind, but aside from their religion, their cultural practices were all just modern day pop culture with an evangelical spin put on them. And it wasn't like, okay, here's my guilty pleasure of, I don't know, Magic the Gathering or Leonard Skinner or whatnot in this box, and then here's my religion in the other. Frequently, all of their pop culture sensibilities, all of their sort of deracinated preferences would spill over into their worship, so that their worship became kind of bland as well. And it had this kind of very modern, not reverent spirit to it that felt like it itself was a form of entertainment. It almost felt in a lot of these evangelical congregations, and this was really more of a 2000s era thing, that it was competing to be another consumer pop product. That there was literally a Mark Rosewater in charge of evangelical churches that was going, how can we make it more fun? How can we make it more fun to be evangelical? We're appealing to we're appearing to all of the Jennies and all of the Timmies in my congregation, but what about for all of the Spike believers? You could literally imagine pastors of that era coming up with Mark Rosewater archetypes of the psychological profiles of each of their consumers, and then trying to sell them on Christianity as part of that consumer identity. And I know that's not actually what was going on. I understand. I understand that wasn't what was actually going on. Evangelicals were, for the most part, devout. They were, for the most part, Bible reading, believing Christians that had deeply spiritual relationships and nuanced relationships with Jesus, with Christ, with the numinous, and they certainly were more spiritually advanced than I was at that time. But from the outside looking in, their form was that of the consumer product as identity. And everyone can see it, and that made their sort of defensive posture and their sort of gregarious over-eagerness all the more transparently weak-looking. And so that's what I mean by that comment. Thank you very much. Ben White, gonna catch the stream later, just started grad school for accounting, and the workload along with my full-time job makes time scarce. Might have to put the ladies on the back burner for a few. Ha ha ha. Well, yeah, the first year of grad school is always hard, but by your second or third year, or if you're going for a PhD, you will have a third year. If you're going for a master's, probably you'll just have a second year. But usually the second year is a lot better. It's a lot more manageable with a master's degree. And if you're a PhD, usually after you get into it a few years, it just becomes really easy to manage because it becomes sort of old hat. It becomes like a job. Ben White for $5 USA. I'm watching the whole debt ceiling drama. I couldn't help but think all of this is just theatrics. The US is never going to pay off its debts. Neither party has a stomach for it, nor will they seriously address this. They can't see beyond the next election. Yeah, this is all theatrics. There is no anti-spending party in the United States because any party that becomes anti-spending will not be able to attract actual power. A thrifty politician is an incompetent politician. To borrow the words of Nick Land, a thrifty politician is an incompetent politician. Borrowing from the future to buy power now is what any rational actor would do, given how we set up the incentives of our system. Now, that being said, our entire economy of America, of Canada, and probably the entire world is one giant debt bomb, which we've over leveraged the identities, the wealth of future generations to essentially make things very, very comfortable for less our generation, more our parents' generation. And this debt bomb is at some point going to either explode or have to be carefully unraveled. And there's going to have to be some leader that does this, maybe a Caesar figure. But if this doesn't get handled, it will eventually explode in everyone's faces. But this problem cannot be tackled through democratic means. There can never be a decrease in spending in any meaningful way through a democracy that works remotely like ours does. Ben White for USA $3. Company sent, another one. The company sent out a company-wide email about celebrating Pride Month. Sure, the economy and society is rotting around us, but let's just celebrate Holy Month and the new state religion. Well, yeah, I mean, your company did this because your HR department told them that they had to have a good display for Pride so that they wouldn't be creating a hostile work environment for their LGBTQA employees, which could result in lawsuits. So they sent out an email to communicate their adherence to the state religion and to show everyone just how of a progressively minded corporation they are. Of course, they believe in none of it. And there's no constituent that is in democracy these days for staving off economic collapse or cultural disintegration. And that's just the sad reality of it. And Jada for $5 USA. Is trans too surface level to worry about it long term? Should we be more concerned with its roots in feminism, re-gender ideology, or gender divide? Feminists are on both the pro and anti-trans sides. And any recommendations to understand feminism? I'm politically dumb, FYI. Well, I mean, I'm going to confess here. I really don't think there's any ideas behind feminism. I think feminism is a response to modern sexual, like in any meaningful way. There was this graph that came out about how all women are getting more progressive and all men are getting more right wing. And people were saying, well, why aren't women very conservative? No, women are more conservative than men are, temperamentally. They like supporting power more than men do. They like being dissidents less than men do. What's causing the divide is that men are becoming right-wing and the establishment is becoming left-wing. And women always go with the establishment. If you go 100 years ago to the 1920s, women were more conservative than men. So what happened? Well, what happened was the sexual revolution. What happened was the revolutions of modernity. Everything having to do with feminism, like the second wave stuff, like Betty Friedan, like Simone de Beauvoir, like Susan Faludi, like Andrea Dworkin, all of that is secondary stuff. What really happened is that women moved into a position where they're wielding power through votes, which, you know, the idea that anyone should wield power through votes is highly questionable. Even more so, dividing family votes up so that you have husbands and wives potentially voting against each other. And you know, also the sexual revolution happened. And the sexual revolution opened up a situation where women could not depend on men taking care of them in marital relationships anymore. And so they were forced to enter the workforce en masse as sort of an insurance policy against men leaving them. Or the potential for men leaving them. And they were also encouraged by the culture at that time to participate in the sexual revolution as a means of getting liberated. And at this point, feminism really is just an expression of adherence to the status quo. These TERFs who are fighting against transgenderism are essentially just people who've been left behind by history. Not to say that they aren't useful. Not to say that they aren't a fruitful way to get more people interested in deeper ideas, but there are no deep ideas behind feminism. What the idea behind feminism actually is this sort of Faustian idea of infinite liberty and self-expression that you saw sort of on display with my debate with Matt McManus. The motivating religious impulse is that sublime religious fulfillment is found in the moment where you make your own choice, where you create your own life. And the chief way you do that is through sexual expression. And if women are going to express that sentiment that, is essentially the sentiment that undergirds all of progressivism, if they are going to express this in a political way, that political expression is going to look like feminism, and it's going to use feminist language. Nobody reads feminist literature and becomes a feminist. What happens is they come in contact with a religious sensation, with a religious idea of self-expression, and feminism is the way to politically express that. It's the way that women would naturally express that ideology if they were forced to inside of politics. And this transgenderism stuff is an extension of that Faustian idea that you express yourself through sexuality. Transgenderism is simply your own gender as a consumer product. Your sex has now become a consumer product, like Magic the Gathering. And so your transition is like buying in. You don't have a sex, you don't have a gender, you have a lifestyle gender. Just like that person from back in Seattle called Netrunner, their lifestyle game. I think that emotionally scarred me. There's that moment when you're genuinely enjoying a board game, and then the person across from you just says the most bugman thing of all time, and there's this moment where you drop the cards and say, "What am I doing?" I mean, that almost ruined the game for me permanently, to be quite honest. So yeah, there's that. That's good. Anyway, yeah, look, I could give you, there are good feminists. There are feminists that are based, like Camille Paglia, and Sexual Persona is a good book, even though I haven't finished it. I read the first 100 pages or whatever. But it's a good book. And Camille Paglia's lectures are divine. But Camille Paglia is not representative of what feminism means to most women. It's not what appeals about feminism about most women. And neurotic people like Andrea Dworkin aren't either. And absolute stooges like Susan Faludi or like, what's her face? Oh, the arch feminist, Gloria Steinem. Absolute stooges aren't embodiments of what the people feel either. They're closer. But what people want to express is, I have a right to liberation, and society needs to make things more comfortable for me pursuing that sexual liberation. And that cause is feminism. And the rest is just post hoc explanation, in my opinion. Eric Lafar for $3 USA. Happy International Neutrality Month. Happy Institutional Neutrality Month, Dave. Yes, indeed. It is the holy month. The holy month for our dear, what did someone call them recently? Wi-Fi password Americans? Alphabet Americans. Their holy month must be celebrated through all the various different institutes, all the different corporations must wave high the flag of pride. For that indeed is the most important thing, the state religion of infinite self-expression. Link $10 USA. Given the profound capture of the system that it would take effect. Let me check the live stream health for a second here. Link for $10 USA. Given the profound capture of the system, what would it take to effectively cut the head off the snake of the woke? Given the legal situation, the easiest source seems to be dismantling the civil rights legislation. If not, then what needs to go down? Schools, media, squash alphabet agencies, etc.? Well, I think, Link, this is unfortunately what Curtis Yarvin said. This is a regime complete problem. Because every single thing, every single piece of this hydra will work to defend the other ones. So if you become president and dominate Congress, and you repeal the 1964 Civil Rights Act, all the other organs of government, the State Department, the unelected government, the Supreme Court, even though it's conservative, the Supreme Court will probably still do this. All of the lower division courts, the entire university system, the entire media, they will all immune react to try to stop you from doing this. Torpedoing civil rights, then you have to make sure that the entire elite class goes along with this. In order to cut the head off the snake, you'd basically need to retire about 50% of the government and retire all of the universities' administrations, and then hire back the researchers you needed to continue on science and engineering. That's the only way that you could cut the head off this snake permanently, because if you cut off one head of the snake, the other two heads of the snake, or the hydra in this case, will swing around and bite you. So you have multiple heads to cut off this snake, which is why all of the policy reactions sound so impossibly grand. I guess there's something to be said for the notion that it's important to keep in mind that the key legislative piece of the puzzle is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. With that law in place, and with its broader interpretations in case law, there is no way around the HR department rulership of corporations and the HR department domination of all private bodies, all private corporate bodies that wield capital. Now, some people have talked about coming up with co-op models, partnerships, 501c3s that could get around the need for these human resource regulations. But even that is a little hard, and it's transparently a dodge, and it would be a question legally how it would hold up once the organization grew to a certain size. So yeah, you're right. I mean, civil rights is essentially legislatively where it would have to begin. But I don't know how you would do that with the entire unelected government at your heels, trying to stop you from doing that, or trying to head off any kind of reform that you could potentially do. Eric LaFar for $15 USA, part 1 of 2. I visited my sister and her husband, married to a conservative Lutheran pastor, homeschooling 3 sons due to corruption in the schools. Before the trip, I asked them to watch Footloose, hoping they would make the connection between 80s era propaganda and where we are today. I'm looking for the second part here. They didn't get it, i.e., censorship is never the answer. The pastor was too hard on his daughter, and the worst from her pastor husband. It's not a pastor's job to keep his town from sin. I had no idea how to fix this. They're convinced they can build walls tall enough. They don't have to make the connection. Well, I mean, is that really the way to do that? Is to show people propaganda and then, wonder why they're having the reaction to the propaganda that they do? I mean, imagine that, right? I mean, let's take the converse reality. Let's say that you were a progressive. Would you go up to your friends who are progressive but not very ideological and show them something like Gone with the Wind or Birth of a Nation, and then ask them what they thought about the characters? Like, was Scarlett O'Hara right to, in that famous scene, slap the slave harshly because she lied about her skills as a midwife? In the context of the movie, she was justified. In the context but in the context of like greater progressive values, she wasn't. Is it right to say that in Birth of a Nation, the how should I put this? The vigilantes dressed in certain colors were correct to fight back against the ravenous hordes that were plaguing the good men and women of the South. Well, in the context of the movie, that was completely justified. As a progressive, it's not. The thing is that these movies, as propaganda, they're designed to be self-justifying. They're designed to give you a narrative where that person is very, very sympathetic. Now, a better question, Eric, might be, how accurate do you think that this was to how 1980s evangelicalism really actually operated? How do you think that the filmmakers had an agenda for making the Christians the villains in this case? And then, or ask them like, what do you think a modern update of Footloose would be? Do you think if they made try this experiment with them? try this experiment. Say like, okay, they're making a modern version of Footloose, where instead of the pastor trying to shut down a group of kids dancing, it's the pastor trying to shut down a group of kids putting on a drag performance in their school for minors. What would they say to that? I think they might see the connection more than if you put it to them like that. If you literally showed them how this is part of the same process, and if they said, "Oh no, that's too far," you could follow up with a question. Well, do you think the people who made this movie would think that was too far? Do you think that they would be against what's going on with the drag queens in the schools now? And the answer is obviously no. Okay, thank you very much, Eric Lafarve, for those 2 very generous super chats, but I'm going to go on here. Philip Pullman for $5 USA. Hey, Dave, how much sway does the regime have? My white sister won't apply to grad school like Iowa or Baylor because they aren't cosmopolitan, aka they're too white. This seems unnatural to me, but can the regime really just convince women of anything? I mean, you can't convince women of anything. I think that I don't think any woman is going to be convinced that seeing male genitalia in a locker room is somehow not threatening. Or that male sexuality in a proximity that's not intimate is not threatening. I think that they can't be convinced of that. But women can easily be convinced that any given color is in or out this year, including the very color that they see on their very skin and the skin of their children. That is something, when it comes to minor fads and fashions, and even fashions portrayed as politics, this is a certain mode that women are very, very easy to sway. Just like men are very, very easy to sway when it comes to rooting for their side in a war. Or for being for victory. We're all going to, was this the famous line that Stephen Molyneux said was, for women, we're all victims. It's not our fault. It's catnip. For men, it's we're going to go to war and we're all going to win as catnip. There are certain things that each of the sexes have an easy time believing. And a certain color or a certain kind of person is now high status is something that women, their antennae are primed to see high status. That's what Juniper Tree's insight was on the whole Bud Light fiasco. Their antenna are geared towards who's in, who's out, what colors are cool, what colors are bad. Orange is the new black, black is the new red, red is the new blue. Short sleeves are really out this year. They're in this year. They're up, they're down. They will always gravitate to those kind of things. So if your sister is status conscious, which she obviously is, and all the media is saying colleges that are too white aren't cosmopolitan, they're not going to go for that. But that being said, you could argue about, how cool is it really to try to chase all of this cosmopolitan university education? That sounds kind of lame and bureaucratic and stupid. But no, this particular mode is a very easy mode for women to get convinced on. Medwords for $3 USA. Hey Dave, thank you for speaking so sensibly about HBD last week. I entirely agree with you on the issue, and most importantly on its proper context within a right-wing Christian worldview. This is the problem with HBD, is that Christians really need to get over this. Christians need to understand that by saying biological differences imply you value souls differently, they're communicating a lack of faith in the divine. They're essentially sublimating their own ideas to materialist pretenses. Christianity says that all peoples have dignity regardless of what qualities they have, regardless of whether the qualities are the same or regardless if they're different. Regardless if some people are taller or shorter, faster or slower, have different ways of thinking, have different ways of speaking, whether that's biological or cultural, Christianity values those people as an image of God. And to say that anybody who talks about differences is denying the dignity of those various people is to betray the fact that you have adopted the atheist and materialist worldview, that the existence of differences in biology must necessarily confer to differences in dignity, and that is just simply not true. We have to be able to come to terms with the diversity of humanity in its biological, cultural, and historic forms, and to learn to be able to embrace that as a positive good. Having a globe of different peoples is enriching, in the same way that hearing stories that come from an African continent is exciting, in a way that having an African Aragorn is not, homogeneously mixed in to a completely deracinated Gondor society where half the people are Asian, or a third of the people are Asian, a third of the people are Caucasian, and a third of the people are African, which makes absolutely no sense. But there we go. Thank you, Medwards. Eric Lafar for $25 USA. Oh, I'm sorry, I already read that one, Eric, but thank you very much anyway. That's part 2. Kevin Pulliam for $3 USA. What is the solution to the college question? About to start a family, and even schools like I always want to say Notre Dame, but it's Notre Dame. That's how we say it in America. Even schools like Notre Dame just posted a rainbow on social media. Do we have to go specifically to mission-focused schools? Well, that depends on what you're getting a degree in, Kevin. If you're going for engineering, there's a certain case for just sucking it up and getting the engineering degree and then getting out. I certainly got my engineering degree that way. If instead you are going to be, going for some kind of degree that requires indoctrination, like theology, like political science, like economics, degrees that typically don't have a large economic payout already, I think looking for an aligned institution is much better. And there are aligned institutions. There are the Hillsdales out there. There are the classical Christian education academies out there that you might want to look into. Really what you want to do is you want to start with your career and money-making scheme in mind, and then build towards that goal in terms of the specific elements of the education that you need to get. Don't try to find the least the least paused college and go to that one, because they all have the same dynamics going on in them. Notre Dame has been woke for a very long time. It's a large school, and it's had woke progressive elements in that since I've been a little kid. And it's been well known to have that dimension in it. And once woke groups are operating inside a university, it's the beginning of the end, because those activist groups will get more and more and more money by cooperating with the regime to subvert the original intention and purpose of the institution in question. Jay Ford for $40 USA. Thank you for all that you do. Catch you at the event. Oh, well, thank you very much. I'll see you at the event. Remind me that I need to work on my speech, which I finished the outline. I'm just going through and making sure the language is right, and then I need to practice speaking it. Owen Zelensky for $5 USA. Hello. One of my favorite aspects of Magic the Gathering has always been the story and lore that the cards have told. Are games more likely to be paused or lifestyled when there is a lore or story connected to it? Also, if it applies, what is your favorite Ravnica guild? Well, this is interesting. It's something that I didn't have a chance to get into in my talk on Magic the Gathering's history. So, this is interesting because initially Magic the Gathering was just supposed to be a generic fantasy environment. The idea was that you make your own story. And you can see this on the flavor text of the cards. The cards used to have either just generic fantasy text on them for flavor, not the rules, but there's little quotes on the cards to give you an idea of what the thing is. They either have a description of the thing in question, or they would have quotes from Shakespeare or Samuel Taylor Coleridge or a variety, or Shakespeare sometimes. And it was really, really awesome. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite cards of all time, I still have a copy of it, from Legends is called Underworld Dreams. And the art of the card is a vision of Dante and Virgil descending into hell next to a lake of fire. And then there's an excerpt from a quote from the Indian poet Raviguda Tagore. I think it's Tagore and not Tagore. No, actually, it's Tagore. It's Tagore. He was a early 20th century excellent Indian Brahmin storyteller and poet, and that was the flavor text of the actual cards. It was, okay, this is just a fantasy element, or maybe it's an element for mythology, and then you get to put it in your deck and you make up your own story, right? And then right around Legends, which is, I think it was Antiquities, and the first expansion set was Arabian Nights, right? And they literally had quotes from the Quran on the cards, and they were literally the pictures from the Arabian Nights stories, right? That gives you an idea of what they were going for. Then around Legends, Magic the Gathering decided that they were going to lean into more of the universe, the lore. And the initial sets were sort of just descriptions of places. So there was one that described an ice age and one that described like the African continent. And there wasn't really a plot. There weren't characters. You could kind of infer, right, that there was a story going on in the background, but it was really more about a setting that was fantastical. Then afterwards, they moved towards like a literal plot line with characters that would move from set to set that you could follow throughout the entire thing. And that's when it really started going downhill, in my opinion, because I guess it was better because the plot still had a tragic dimension to it. But I never really believed that the Magic the Gathering plot with the characters was very interesting at all. And it's only gotten worse and worse. And now I look at it right now and it's just a complete mess. It feels like it's copied from the Marvel movies. All of the flavor having to do with cultural elements that came from real and existing folklore have been kind of sublimated. All the planeswalkers are a complete United Colors of Benetton mix of all different races. And the plot lines, again, they feel like Marvel movie plot lines. And that's before they're dumping every other IP into the mix and completely ruining everything. As for your questions, are games more likely to be paused or lifestyled when there is lore or story connected to it? No, not really. I think that, Magic the Gathering has persisted despite of its lore. I talk to a lot of people who play Magic the Gathering since I played every now and again. And you are one of the few people who have told me that they really love the lore of this game. Most people I know my age felt that it was never good to begin with, and to the extent that it was, it dropped off in the early 2000s. Also, if it applies, what's your favorite Ravnica guild? So Ravnica guilds are just combinations of two colors, and my favorite is Boros, which is red and white. Red is any deck that plays red is my color. Aggressive is always the way to play games. It's always the most fun, and if you want your opponent to lose, you want them to lose quickly, right? Link for $3 USA. I like your talk at the end about building parallel networks for products, but I wonder how would you apply it to media products? Can't exactly replicate Ghibli at home, at least in terms of the infrastructure. Well, here's the interesting thing about that, Link, right? So right around the time that I was into Magic the Gathering, into high school, I was also into anime. And I'm really dating myself right now, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, people used to literally copy video cassettes for each other and run, because you couldn't buy anime at the store. People would translate their own anime, and they would re-record old Japanese pirated copies, and they would circulate it on CDs, on DVDs, on AVI files, on BitTorrents later than that, and before that on VCR tapes. That was really old back in the 90s. And that the whole community was around that. I saw Laputa Castle in the Sky on a pirated VHS tape. That was my first viewing of Studio Ghibli. the and then when I got into other anime, it was all on pirated CDs because again, this is really before around 2003. Anime was a specialty product. It wasn't really something that was super mainstream. And in the 90s, it was all like on VHS tapes, right? But I think that the real struggle right now is to establish that physical copies are the name of the game and that you have a right to use your physical copy media in any way you want. If you want to, and this is also something we used to do back in the day as anime fans, we used to go to our local university, find a lecture hall, and then we used to take the pirated copies, like the VHS tapes and the CDs, and plug them into the big projectors there, because this was like in chemistry halls, and then we used to watch, as high school students, we used to watch the movies on the big screen, and the quality was horrible because these things were like multiple copied VHS tapes and they're being projected on this huge screen. So you could see, I mean, forget about dropped frames. You were seeing this fuzz for a lot of it. It was exciting. It was cool. I imagine that we might be going back to that if sort of woke capital gets worse and worse and worse. People might actually start censoring older versions of media, in which case a large struggle of networks will be to come up with libraries and recommendation systems and lending systems for old books, for new books. I think having a system of loaning books to people would be a major thing for basket weavers. As basket weaver book clubs, I have multiple copies of Flannery O'Connor. If people were doing a Flannery O'Connor book, I could furnish them with all the books. And in this day and age, like books are $20 for a paperback in some areas. It's absolutely nuts. Working on creating lending libraries through basket weaving groups is something that I haven't done yet. We've done game nights through basket weaving. We've done, drop-ins for basket weaving for playing nerd games. We have not yet, in my area, done the book group. And we have not yet done the lending library. But doing lending libraries would be a good way of building parallel products that use corporate IP and that flaunt IP restrictions in a way that saves you money and that also builds relationships with people that are ideologically aligned to you. Xavier Golemgesk for $10 USA. I really like 40K and fantasy battles, but hate Games Workshop. There are a ton of 3D artists who make Warhammer proxies. If one shared my values, I would so find that. I think you mean I would so buy that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Games Workshop is a horrible offender of this. I mean, the one problem with Games Workshop is they are in possession of a technology that no one else has, which is they are the best shouldn't take the Lord's name in vain. They're the best damn plastic molders I have ever seen on the planet. Their plastic molding procedures are out of this world. Their ability to carve microscopic features into plastic and metal casts is insane. And they're a decade ahead of all their competitors, even other 3D artists. So I would actually like that too. The first thing to do if and I don't actually play Warhammer. I actually, back in 2020, I painted a Warhammer army, and then I ran out of time and I stopped doing it. But I've played only a few times, so I'm not really into this game at all. But I understand it, and I like Sargon's apparently into the hobby, and a bunch of other people are. And historical war games are a lot of fun. The first thing you have to do is you have to set up playing groups of people who use different rule systems than Games Workshop systems. There are a lot of good miniature agnostic gaming systems out there. And once you have that, it should be an open question of being able to use whatever miniatures you want and craft your own armies and stuff like that. And it would be a lot of fun, especially since, oh my God, when you are into sort of nerdy hobbies, you follow people like Tolarian Community College, and every time I know the moment there's a particular video, I'm always waiting for a person to make this video, because whenever they make this video, I unsubscribe to them. And that video is, oh my God, this historical board game allows you to play as the Nazis. I've seen that so many times from war game blogs. And every time they make that article, every time they write the article about how it's wrong to make somebody in a World War II board game play as the Germans, I unsubscribe. I have family members who fought for the Germans in World War II. The fuck I can't play a board game with a Panzer tank in it. And it's infantilizing to claim otherwise. This is absolutely nuts. It's infantile, it's stupid, it's insulting. I feel it's borderline libelous towards Germans and people who... I don't care what war you fought in. I don't care if you fought on the Soviet side. I don't care if you fought on the German side. I don't care if you fought on the Japanese side. I don't care if you fought for Genghis Khan or for Tamerlane. All soldiers are heroes. All soldiers are heroes because they take their lives in their own hands and fight for what they believe in. That does not mean that there are no such things as war crimes. It does not mean that it's okay to genocide people. But in the heat of the battle, heroism always exists on both sides. And in the event that we have the chance to tear down statues of the Red Army, even though I have family members who suffered grievously at the hands of the Red Army, I would fight against that attempt, because it would be a besmirchment of the Russian soldiers who, even though they fought for an evil man Stalin, were nonetheless good. And I hate that about every time I see an idiotic war game person make that blog article, I immediately unsubscribe. And, you know, I think there probably are aligned people who make their own miniatures. And this, I mean, I don't know, there are certainly people who do 3D printing. If you're talking about people who do, like, it's not pewter, I know, but if you're talking about tin, pewter, alloy molding or plastic molding, that might be a much, much taller order. That takes a large industrial facility. There are only a very few suppliers that are actually able to use that type of manufacturing technology. And you know, so I don't know, that might be harder to get. That might be future times. But in the meantime, it's very easy to buy used products, which don't give Games Workshop any money. It's very, you know, all my products I bought used. It's very, very easy to find third-party suppliers that are not aligned to a corporate product. And that also helps break the system. But the most important thing is to use a miniature agnostic wargaming system in your war games. That's the most important thing, because that helps build a community around an ecosystem that cannot be controlled by Games Workshop, that cannot be shut down and reconfigured based on what Games Workshop themselves likes. Sam153, $10. Thanks for the stream. All the best. Thanks you very much, Sam. I always appreciate the no comment super chats later in the evening. Bedell Cashflow for $8. I'm going to check the health of the stream. Okay, doing all right. Bedell Cashflow for $8 USA. Hey Dave, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate your insight on these contemporary issues. We need more people like you in this world. Well, thank you very much, and I'm going to get back to essay writing after I finish the Sildings talk. I've got like 3 of them in the works, and I can't do any of them until I finish my Sildings talk. But I always feel like the essays are better than these live streams, even though, you know, it's basically the same. I talk about the same things, just more extemporaneously, usually. But thank you very much for the $8. And it helps me keep the channel going. GT333 for $10 USA. What is your favorite Corp and Netrunner factions? Will you play me a game of Netrunner one day? Any thoughts on the Nisei project? It's a Netrunner fan-made life support committee that re-released new sets yearly, unfortunately ran by hardcore wokies. I have followed Nisei. I actually have their products. Yeah, they are insufferable progressives. I hate those guys. Netrunner fans are more woke than their corporate Fantasy Flight counterparts, and I hate it. And I really wish I could have a based Netrunner community. My favorite faction, my favorite corporate faction is my favorite corporate faction is Wayland. Jinteki is also kind of cool. I never figured out how to play NBN, and my favorite runner faction is anarchists. Criminals and shapers are okay, but whenever I play a runner, I always play an anarchist because I just want to break into the servers and burn them to the ground and burn the corporation to the ground. And I don't really care if I win as long as the corporation is a smoldering heap of garbage by the time I'm done with it. Right. So that's maybe you've marked me as more of a Mark Rosewater, Timmy in that moment. But there was also a few really great. Who was it? The Hammer of Humanity, Kim, the anti-AI runner, was really great. I always really sympathize with him. The anti-AI, anti-technology Uncle Ted runner who wanted to destroy all technology and was using hacking to destroy technology companies. So, Netrunner also has the advantage in taking place in a world that highly represents ourselves. And for a while, right, Fantasy Flight had this complaint that the fans would hack in to into their servers and steal their IP, and the corporation Fantasy Flight would issue press releases like, "We know that this game is about hacking into corporations and stealing our IP. Well, please don't hack into our servers and steal our IP." Which was always the height of irony, I thought. But it would be really, I did like the Nisei project because they've taken Nisei did what Magic the Gathering fans should be doing to Wizards of the Coast right now, and I don't see why they don't. Which is they took the IP and they just printed it themselves and played the game without any corporate supervision. The problem is it's impossible to find any people who play Nisei in a reasonable radius. And, when I play games, like, the clock is ticking because I'm usually playing either on babysitter time, and that's expensive. And so, I have to go to a place that's close, or I have to have someone over to my house and play. And if there's nobody in the area that plays this game, which there isn't, in this case, I can't play it. So, that's a good geeking out a lot on this stream, so please forgive me, but it is what it is. I will geek out about Netrunner for as long as you give me rope to hang myself with. That is good. Dreadnought, $10 USA. Hey Dave, just made it back from our ICAA potluck. Gonna enjoy the break over summer and going to miss these people, but also looking forward to our next class. I can never thank you enough for provoking me into the church. Anyway, wanted to support you. Also, what's your favorite Fallout faction? Fallout. I mean, so first of all, thank you. Congratulations on RCIA. That's awesome. I teach Sunday school, and I'm actually really looking forward to redesigning my curriculum for next year's Sunday school. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I actually got into teaching Sunday school because my wife volunteered and then had another obligation, and I had to take it over for her, but it was really a lot of fun. So God be praised for your coming back to the church. You and I together will fight this decline we're going through because Mother Church needs us more now than ever. As for my favorite Fallout faction, I don't really play video games. I haven't played video games since 2013. I did play Fallout in 2012 when it was a thing. I have a very vague recollection of a video game that I played 12 years ago, but I did like the fact that the Brotherhood of Steel was degenerate. And I don't know, and I hated the Northern California Republic. So Fallout is a post-apocalyptic environment where there's a bunch of factions that are sort of trying to retake control over the United States. And the NCR, the New California Republic, is supposed to be the good faction, but it's like, what if shitlibs survive the apocalypse? What if California shitlib survived the apocalypse and wanted to recreate California shitlibbery? One of the few things that's potentially an upside of imminently staring down nuclear war with Russia, as we are every day because of this Ukrainian fiasco, is a possibility that maybe nuclear war will wipe out the shitlibs. So I think that, like, the new California Republic is my ultimate nightmare. That somehow California shitlibs survived the apocalypse and emerged even stronger than before. I can't think of a single faction in Fallout that I liked. They all were horrible. They all were absolutely deplorable, in my opinion. I couldn't find any good guys. So, sorry I can't answer that question. And again, it's been 10 years ago. I don't know. Wasn't there like an Elvis faction? I'll just say them, right? The Elvis faction. Xavier Golemgesk for $5 USA. I really like 3D printing for minis, but I'm a little worried about the environmental impact of all the slime resin I go through. Lol. Well, man, I really don't think that the slime resin from printing resin miniatures is going to have a noticeable impact on anything. And I thought that stuff was recyclable. Is that not reprocessable? How is resin not reprocessable? That makes zero sense to me. The biggest problem with 3D printing is that it's of markedly lower quality than what you get from mold systems, which is what all of the major corporate stuff uses. And if you have a hobby of painting, having a higher quality molded miniature is just a lot more fun to paint. And anyway, thank you very much. Although you 3D print, so maybe you should connect to the previous super chatter to see if you could commission some 3D printing. Although these days 3D printers are so common. Rat Splatigan for $5 USA. Damn, I miss Scrub Sprites. Scrub Sprites was an early Magic card from the initial Richard Garfield game. That was, by modern standards, pretty bad, but was a great card back in the day. And yeah, I mean, I really like all of those old cards. Any old card I love. I love how it's printed. I love the primitive illustrations. I like the fact that it looks like a grad student project. And I absolutely love the fact that they printed quotes from classical literature on... I read Rime of the Ancient Mariner in 4th grade because it was on a Magic card. Like, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Isn't that crazy? 5th grade. Sorry, 5th grade. Because it's on a Magic card. That's nuts. It encouraged me to pick up all of these things and examine them and kind of appreciate them in a way that, I wouldn't have. And it's a stupid fantasy game. I mean, this is what really they took from us, right? If games could be reclaimed in these radical ways, you could use something like Magic the Gathering as an educational experience. And a rich one at that as well. I read the Arabian Nights because of the Arabian Nights expansion set, like the original Richard Burton translations with all of the horrible racism and like the really racy scenes. It was amazing, and I read that in 6th grade because of Magic the Gathering. I was the first person to discover that Aladdin was Chinese. And anyway. Oh man, have you ever guys have read the original Arabian Nights? That is some wild stuff. If you think racism was a European construction, you need to read the Arabian Nights and see what they thought of other races. Especially, I'm not going to mention the ones that come into particular derision by the Persian author of Arabian Nights, but I think you might imagine which ones. They aren't too fond of Europeans, but Europeans certainly aren't the bottom rung in the imagination of Persians. I'll say that. Xavier Golemgesk for $5 USA. I like Cyberpunk, but it shocks me how many fans are wokies when corps in the real world are obviously pro-woke. Yeah, I mean, this is another thing too. The original Richard Garfield game. This is something that I really didn't like about the Fantasy Flight Android Netrunner, even though they took Richard Garfield's design and they redesigned it so that it was better. They updated it with sort of the learnings that we've experienced for 20 years of game design, specifically ones learned by Mark Rosewater. So they made a better game, and it's basically the same game. But the art on the original Netrunner it's like 90s digital art. It's like a barf. But what it depicts is like a dark universe that's incredibly uncomfortable, that's incredibly dark. You would not want to live in the universe of the original Netrunner, which is the Cyberpunk 2022 environment. You would not want to live in that environment whatsoever. It looks horrible, and the corporations look soulless and life crushing. When they redesigned Android Netrunner, the cyberpunk dystopia is a lot more fun. Corporations are more bubbly. There's a good side to them. Not everything is so bleak. All of the runners look like social justice warriors, which is okay because looking like a blue-haired freak is kind of part of the aesthetic of cyberpunk. But at the same time, they look less nightmarish. There isn't that William Gibson body horror from all of the modifications people do to themselves in Android Netrunner. And so oftentimes, a lot of the people who got into that game seem to believe that Android Netrunner betrayed a universe that we should aspire to, where infinite possibility was expressible in the internet, and real heroism was achievable on the internet. Not to get, again, not to go back into nerd ranting here, but in the Netrunner game, as I mentioned previously, there were three types of runners: criminals who ran for money, anarchists who ran for political purposes and to burn the corporations to the ground, either for anti-technology or for communist or for traditionalist causes, and then shapers. And shapers were the Faustian, I want to express myself in the maximum liberty sense. And I always thought that concept that you would engage in a political cause for maximum self-expression was stupid and just sort of completely anti-cyberpunk. At its core, it was completely anti-cyberpunk, and the incorporation of social justice into the Android universe robbed it of the richness that existed in William Gibson's original Neuromancer novel, which is obviously the inspiration for the game to begin with. Here is Rat Splatigan saying sprites. Yes, I'm a Magic the Gathering old schooler. I knew you meant scrub sprites, so thank you very much for the updated super chat. Perhaps the last one of the evening, Dreadnought for $5 USA. I gotta admit that I kind of like East Coast Brotherhood. Honor, duty, and protecting people from mutants, bandits, and evil tech. Agree that the NCR is boring and loathsome. Agree, I do like that they are portrayed as degenerate and failing New Vegas. Yeah, but would they, if you did a modern iteration, I think they'd just be the good guys. I think that the NCR being kind of having a dark side to them is kind of something that wouldn't hold up. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So you're talking about, so this is a Fallout question from Dreadnought's original. I remember this universe so vaguely. I played the game 10 years ago. But one thing I really didn't like is I did not like the Brotherhood of Steel being the heroes. I like the idea that people who were designed to be heroes became sort of a technologically regressive cult. They began worshiping the technology that they were the stewards of. And that somehow felt fitting to me. That somehow felt more in keeping with the 1970s apocalyptic fantasy that it's based on. If you want to go back to an earlier ancestor of Fallout, I would advise you to watch the movie A Dog and His Boy, an incredibly, I mean, it's very low budget, but it's a 1970s sci-fi movie, and it's an incredibly low budget movie, but it captures sort of the feeling, sort of what happens if we nuke the 1950s, but somehow the culture of the 1950s persisted in a post-Fallout state. And they're very good. Omega Man 2, which is a takeoff on the I Am Legend novel from the 1960s, which was the originator of one of the first zombie books. Oh, is also another one of those post-apocalyptic things where the 1950s is continued onward. And I felt that having the NCR devolve or not the NCR, the Brotherhood of Steel devolve into a tech cult is much more in keeping with the original vision of what we now call atom punk, but what I would call classic post-apocalyptic science fiction fantasy. Thank you very much, though. Dreadnought for $3 USA. Man, I guess CD Projekt Red got Cyberpunk 2077 right, because the corporations are soulless and inhuman. The environment is shot, and almost everyone is atomized out for themselves. Well, yeah. So Cyberpunk 2077 is the same universe as the original Netrunner from the original Netrunner from the 1990s, and it's bleak. I actually never played Cyberpunk 2077 because that was the year my son was born, and I had no time, and I don't play. Actually, I haven't played a AAA video game since BioShock Infinite in 2013. That was 10 years ago. So I'm not into 3D video games at all. But I do love the cyberpunk literature, and I do love William Gibson's original Sprawl trilogy, which is just chef's kiss, amazing 1980s science fiction. And I do think that 2077, or what we used to call 2022, capture that feeling much better than the Android universe, which tries to sugarcoat it. If you're sugarcoating cyberpunk, you've really fucked up, in my opinion. And I don't mean to swear, but I don't know how to put it more emphatically. Sugarcoating cyberpunk is ruining cyberpunk. It would be like, it's like sugarcoating a sirloin steak with ketchup. You're ruining it. Link for $5 USA. In response to the previous answer, I agree it seems like a pretty hard problem to solve. The only solution I could see on the grand scale would be an alliance of our elites with foreign powers, a la aristocratic plebs with Greek city-states. Link, your original question was that how to decapitate the snake? Well, I think what's going to happen is I think that local administration is going to go out of control of the federal government more and more and more and more. And that's where we have to focus. We have to focus on asserting local control with local politics and local networking. There will be destabilizing elements coming into the system from foreign actors. That will be for sure. But the future is that the macrocosmic systems are probably not reformable at the scale they are right now without some kind of Caesar figure. And I really don't think a foreign power could accomplish that through an invasion, and that would be horrific if they did. But that's just, with our levels of technology, with our levels of geopolitical uncertainty, that seems to be completely impossible and kind of cloud cuckoo land. So I think that what we're going to see is sort of a managerial return to local control. I'm not certain that's going to be the case. I think we could just be experiencing decline for the foreseeable future, but that's what it appears like is happening. Okay, so that appears to be the end of the super chats. So I will now continue on reading the psalm, and we are not on Psalm 30. I thought we were on Psalm 10. Okay, my bookmark fell out and fell into the wrong place. So the psalm for the evening is... Well, my voice is too... That's combined. So I'll do Psalm 11 instead. Psalm 11. In the Lord I have taken my refuge. How can you say, my soul, fly like a bird to its mountain? See the wicked bracing their bow. They are fixing their arrows on the string, to shoot upright men in the dark. Foundations once destroyed, what can the just do? The Lord is in his holy temple, the Lord whose throne is in heaven. His eyes look down on the world. His gaze tests mortal men. The Lord tests the just and the wicked. The lover of violence he hates. He sends fire and brimstone on the wicked. He sends a scorching wind as their lot. The Lord is just and loves justice. The upright shall see his face. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Fiddler's Green podcast number 36 for this June 2nd, 2023. Have a wonderful rest of the evening and a blessed week. I will probably talk to you again next week. And please, if you are so inclined, check out the Sildings Conference in Tennessee coming up at the end of the month. I will see you all there. And until then, I'll catch you on the next live stream. Have a good evening and a blessed week.